I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the third episode in our week-long series focused on big election issues. Today's episode, climate change. Since his presidential campaign, Donald Trump has been a climate change skeptic.
Who believes in global warming?
All of this with the global warming and that, a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry, okay? It's a hoax.
And even though he recently kind of acknowledged climate change, so far in his presidency, we've seen a lot of things that made climate scientists nervous. Information about climate change and renewable energy has been scrubbed from government websites. President Trump signed an executive order making it easier to produce fossil fuels like coal and natural gas. And of course, he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And Trump says, basically, we don't know for sure if the changes we're seeing to our planet are because of climate change that was caused by humans.
You don't know whether or not that would have happened with or without man. You don't know.
What about the scientists who say it's worse than ever?
You'd have to show me the scientists.
Show me the scientists? Okay. But the truth is, while it's easy to dismiss climate change deniers, there were times when scientists weren't sure what was going on here. It took years to uncover it. And that's what we're talking about today. This episode was originally published last year, and we've updated it with new science. So here it is, Science versus Climate Change. Yep, we're pitting facts against our future.
Got ocean all around us. We can look down and see little...
Is that a dolphin?
Oh, that was a little dolphin, yeah.
Oh, whoa!
Surprisingly small, though. I wonder what that was.
I'm walking on a pier in San Diego, California with Ralph Keeling. He's a professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Oh, and look at the school of fishes.
The dolphins went right by them. They must not be hungry.
Maybe they felt bad interrupting them while they were at school.
I can't touch that.
Yep, just two nerds hanging out. Ralph has taken me out on the pier to do something that his family has been doing for decades. Collecting air samples. You see, Ralph's dad was a scientist too. His name was David Keeling, and David took the very first precise measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Ralph tells me the air has to be pretty damn clean to get a good reading. So that's why we're out on the pier, to get as far away from traffic as possible. We even have to hold our breath when taking the sample, because when humans breathe, we breathe out carbon dioxide.
You wait until you're ready to take a sample, and then you hold your breath, and you walk into the wind.
Ralph whips out something that looks like a glass balloon. All the air has already been sucked out of it, so it creates a vacuum inside. And when Ralph carefully opens the vessel, air gets sucked in.
Now I close it off, and we have an air sample.
It's cool because you can't see it, and then it just makes these noises as to show this is a vacuum. And
that's one of the amazing things about this work, is that it's really Mother Nature speaking through what you're doing, and you're actually tapping into it.
Back in the 1950s, when Ralph's father started taking these carbon dioxide measurements, he learned a lot from Mother Nature. In fact, those measurements helped create a new field of climate science and changed our understanding of the world in ways that we're still grappling with today. You see, when it comes to climate change, many of us still have doubts. A recent Pew survey found that only about half of Americans think that climate change is caused by humans, and the rest say it's either the result of natural causes or there's no evidence for it at all. Yet, at least 97% of climate scientists agree that it is extremely likely that climate change is caused by human activities. So on today's show, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of climate science, to when Ralph's father first started taking his measurements. And we're going to ask, how are scientists so sure that carbon dioxide is warming the world? And why do they think that humans are to blame? Then we're going to look into the climate change crystal ball to try to figure out, what is this warming going to do to our planet? When it comes to climate change, there are lots of opinions. But then there's science.
Science versus climate change is coming up just after the break.
This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon-neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability.
This is Rachel E. Cargill, author of A Renaissance of Our Own, a memoir and manifesto on reimagining. A Renaissance of Our Own is a deeply personal and insightful approach to finding the courage to look at the world and say, I want something different. It serves as a reminder of the power and possibility of reimagining a life that feels right, all the way down to the marrow of your bones. A Renaissance of Our Own, available wherever books and audiobooks are sold.
Welcome back. We're starting our story of climate change in the 1950s when Ralph Keeling was just a kid and he used to go visit his father in his lab, and Ralph still remembers what it looked like.
Had all these glass tubes and pumps whirring, and there was a cartoon on television called Felix the Cat, who had this sort of mad scientist guy, Poindexter, who also had glassware that would occasionally blow up on him. My exposure to science consisted of that cartoon on television in my father's lab, and they were very concordant.
Let's go to the laboratory.
Now, while Felix the Cat was running in the background, the elder Keeling was working on this experiment that had nothing to do with climate science at first. Ralph's father was researching rocks, but for that project, he had to know how much carbon dioxide was in the air. And this was a problem, because at the time, there was no way to precisely measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So he had to invent something. And he did. A machine. Those were the noisy pumps that Ralph remembers. And this machine was a breakthrough, because before that, we could only get really rough estimates of how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere. But Ralph's dad's machine, it was the first that could very precisely measure how much CO2 was in the air. It could measure carbon dioxide down to parts per million.
What is parts per million? What does that actually mean?
So, yeah, if you have a million molecules of air, it means that out of those million, 315 are carbon dioxide molecules.
It's a tiny percentage.
Well, it's small, but sometimes things that are in small abundance matter.
And Ralph's dad, David, was just about to find out how important small things could be. In 1958, David's first measurement showed that there were around 313 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But he soon noticed that CO2 levels were creeping up and up and up. In 1969, a decade after he first started tracking it, he noted that carbon dioxide was up by 8 parts per million. David knew this was no anomaly. He later described it as unmistakable. And this was because he wasn't just going on one measurement. He helped set up instruments in other sites around the world. Hawaii, Alaska, New Zealand, the South Pole, and even over the Pacific Ocean. Some pilots were recruited to capture air samples during Air Force recon flights. By the mid-1970s, the fact that carbon dioxide was going up was a scientific certainty. But that doesn't mean it felt like a big deal. Some of David's colleagues even thought that he should stop measuring it.
I think a lot of his colleagues thought, oh, you're nuts to keep that going.
But David, he did keep going. He didn't know exactly what the increasing numbers would mean for the world, but he felt that the change he was seeing was important and something worth keeping track of.
And so he realized that his work had a different kind of importance, because if he abandoned it, humanity would not know what was happening right now, and that ought to matter.
And then, in the late 1970s, scientists noticed another change. Teams all around the world saw that the average global surface temperature was rising too. Temperatures in the 1970s were about 0.5 degree Celsius or 0.9 Fahrenheit warmer than almost 100 years before. And so, to explain it, scientists, including David Keeling, dug up this 100-year-old theory. You see, in the late 1800s, a Swedish chemist named Svante Arrhenius knew that carbon dioxide could absorb heat from the sun. So he calculated that if we had more and more carbon dioxide, say by burning fossil fuels, it would absorb more and more heat, ultimately trapping heat inside the Earth's atmosphere and acting kind of like a blanket over our planet. But while a few scientists had pursued that theory back at the turn of the century, it hadn't really taken off. And that was pretty much because no one could measure carbon dioxide precisely enough to recognise the changes that were happening. That was until David Keeling invented that machine. But once David's data was out there, then his colleagues started thinking. Take this theory that Svante had, combine it with David's undeniable findings, and it was possible to explain why the world was getting warmer. Because of carbon. But there wasn't scientific consensus. In fact, a big National Academy of Sciences report written in 1983 said that while carbon dioxide was a compelling theory as to explain why the world might be warming, it was not yet confirmed as the culprit. Why? Because there were other suspects around. So, what were those other suspects? One of them was pretty explosive. Volcanoes. Some scientists thought that perhaps there hadn't been as many volcanic eruptions recently. Volcanic eruptions inject a whole bunch of junk into the stratosphere, ash, dust, and sulfur dioxide. And this stuff reflects sunlight away from the Earth. It can, in fact, cool parts of the world down. In the 18th century, a volcano erupted in northern Europe for 8 months, leaving the northern hemisphere about 1 degree Celsius colder than usual. So, some of those scientists noticing warming in the 1970s thought maybe fewer volcanoes were erupting and that was warming the world. To test this out, scientists looked through historical data and found that in the second half of the century, there actually were a bunch of eruptions in Mexico, the Philippines, and even more recently, in 2010, a volcano in Iceland spewed ash into the air for more than 5 weeks. Do you remember this one? It caused havoc to air traffic as well as reporters who couldn't pronounce it.
The glacier is called Eyjafjallajökull.
Eyjafjallajökull. Just think of, hey, you forgot your yogurt.
No, I've got it. So in 2010, the volcano spewed ash and dust in the air like other volcanoes recently. So, the number of eruptions hadn't changed on average, but the temperature of the world kept going up. So, scientists moved on. Some tried to find other explanations, pinning it on changes in how the Earth spins around the sun. Because the Earth can orbit just a touch closer or further away from the sun, sending our climate into a flux. Or perhaps it was changes in the sun's activity that was explaining this change in temperature. But the sun tends to power up and down in 11-year cycles, and the Earth's orbit changes over hundreds of thousands of years. They just didn't line up with the trends that scientists were seeing. So these were all ruled out too. Really, the big thing they kept turning back to was what that Swedish guy had said more than 100 years ago, that carbon dioxide was trapping heat from the sun and warming the world. And Ralph Keeling reckons that it's kind of incredible that this theoretical prediction from 100 years ago lines up with what we're actually seeing today.
It's a triumph of science. It doesn't feel like a triumph for humanity, but it was a triumph for science.
Back in Ralph's office, he showed me all the measurements that he and his dad have made.
So you're looking at carbon dioxide starting in 1950.
Almost 60 years of samples. And it's a graph with one line going up. And it's now called the Keeling curve.
315 parts per million, and they rise up to the right to something around 405 parts per million.
405 parts per million. So that's up 92 parts per million from when the Keelings first started measuring CO2. And when it comes to warming, the last 3 decades have each successively been the warmest decade at the Earth's surface since 1850. Okay, so thanks to the Keeling's work, we know that carbon dioxide is rising. We know that it's warming the world. But those facts alone don't mean that humans are responsible. So, how did science reach that conclusion? The thing is that carbon dioxide doesn't just come from burning fossil fuels. It's all around us. It's in the atmosphere. Humans breathe it out, and plants absorb it when they grow. The oceans soak up and release carbon dioxide. In many ways, the planet is kind of constantly breathing in and out carbon dioxide. But carbon dioxide is also pumped out when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. So, to find out whether more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was from the planet breathing or fossil fuels or something else, we have to investigate the carbon dioxide measurements that the Keelings and others have made. And this is something that Chris Field, a professor of environmental studies and director of the Stanford Woods Institute in California, told us all about.
And the scientists kind of act like detectives. They use a variety of techniques, like on CSI.
When was the last time you watched CSI?
Oh, I don't know, is CSI even still on?
He's probably more into The Good Wife. And Chris has been studying the secrets of carbon dioxide for decades. And so how can we track what is carbon dioxide that's being farted out of trees and animals, and what is carbon dioxide that's coming from fossil fuels?
It's really pretty easy. And I need to do a little mini chemistry lesson to help make this clear. But
Wowee!
you can think about several flavors of carbon dioxide.
Chris basically tells us that there are different types of carbon out there. And this may sound surprising, but there's carbon that's not radioactive and carbon that is radioactive. Radioactive carbon disappears over a very, very long period of time. Now, anything on the Earth's surface with carbon in it has both kinds of carbon. It's got the radioactive kind and the non-radioactive kind. So, yes, you and me, we're all a little bit radioactive. And so are all the plants and the animals that you see around you. But there's something that has practically no radioactive carbon in it, and that's fossil fuels. Why? Because fossil fuels are made of dead animals and plants that have been buried for millions of years. And during that time, the radioactive carbon inside them slowly disappears. So after millions of years, it's pretty much gone. So when we burn oil and gas and coal today, they basically don't have radioactive carbon left in them, just that other kind of carbon. So when scientists like Ralph measure samples of air, they find lots of carbon that doesn't have any radioactivity, meaning it's carbon that's been smushed beneath the Earth's surface for millions of years.
Of the human-released CO2, because it doesn't have any of this radioactivity. When Keeling started his measurements, we could tell really, really clearly, and we see the signal.
And that's how scientists know whether carbon in the air is from burning fossil fuels or from the planet breathing.
And that signal is really very, very clear.
Using these measurements and other studies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, announced in 2014 that there was enough evidence to say that it was extremely likely that the burning of fossil fuels was the main cause of climate change in the mid-20th century. And by the way, they also wrote that it's not just carbon dioxide causing all this trouble. There are other greenhouse gases, such as methane, which partly comes from cows belching, and nitrous oxides, as well as water vapour. And Chris says that if there was a big problem with this conclusion, at this point, we would know, because scientists have been trying to poke holes in it for years.
So every scientist out there is banging on this infrastructure of knowledge as hard as he or she can to find what's wrong with it. And nobody's found a flaw. Everybody fine-tunes, but everybody's trying to find that big flaw that would make him or her famous.
So, this is why 97% or more of climate scientists agree that warming trends are caused by human activities. But just because most of science can agree on that point doesn't mean the experts have it all figured out. Because there's still a lot of disagreement about what comes next. What will all of this warming mean for our future? And this disagreement is happening right up close. Right at Ralph Keeling's lab, in fact.
Oh, there's Steve. This is Wendy.
Hey.
How are you? She's a mobile reporting unit. Very cool.
This is Dr. Steve Piper, a specialist in geochemistry at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And he's been working alongside Ralph and his dad for decades.
That's right.
Very distinguished scientist.
I started with the first Keeling, and now I'm on the second Keeling. A whole career with the Keeling.
And what did you think about that trend line that kept going up and up? Were you worried?
No, not particularly. I tend to be one that thinks there's some way around every problem. I don't like to jump on the bandwagon.
What's the bandwagon?
Well, you're going to really nail me on it, aren't you? Well, the bandwagon to me is like, it's going to be a total catastrophe. I tend to be more of a skeptic.
When you say a skeptic.
I must say, so there's no question that CO2 is increasing and it's caused by man. And we can show it's well correlated with fossil fuel consumption. So then the next question is temperature increasing? It's well established that the surface air temperature is increasing. I mean, there are still questions about what the real dangerous impacts are going to be of the change, I think.
In other words, maybe we shouldn't be so worried. But some people, they are worried. We'll tell you how worried you should be after the break.
Quentin here runs a sustainable clothing brand.
Hi there.
He's excited that his shipping company, FedEx, has set a goal of having carbon-neutral operations by 2040.
Impressive.
When an influencer tweeted about his recycled bamboo t-shirts, Quentin unexpectedly became quite popular.
I'll take it.
He uses FedEx to reach new customers around the globe while making Earth a priority. FedEx, where now meets next.
Welcome back. Okay, so carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going up, and that's mainly due to burning fossil fuels. That gas is trapping heat and warming our planet. And what we haven't talked about yet is the many, many changes that scientists are seeing all around the world. So let's take a trip around this planet of ours to see what this heating and carbon dioxide is doing.
I'm Blair Truen. I'm a senior climatologist with the Australian Bureau of Meteorology.
Hi, I'm Jane Hill. I'm a professor of ecology at York in the UK.
I'm Region Bhaktakaishta. I work in the Kathmandu University in Nepal. Well, my name is Mark Serez, and I'm an Arctic climate scientist.
I'm Marcia Macedo. I work in the southeastern Brazilian Amazon. We've seen more intense wildfires, and we've seen forests that previously wouldn't burn more than once every 500 years, burn several times in a decade.
2013, 14 and 15 were the three warmest springs on record for Australia.
So on average, butterflies in the UK are shifting northwards by about 2 kilometres a year.
I'm in the Fiji Islands. The change in seawater temperature is very profound effects on the coral bleaching.
In the case of Himalayan glaciers in Nepal now, we are seeing that the glaciers are becoming smaller and smaller.
Back in the 1980s, in, say, late August, early September, the Arctic Ocean was white. White because it was covered with sea ice. And if you look at it today, it's so different. It's mostly a blue ocean now.
So, climate change is happening right now. It's changing the way that butterflies and many other animals, in fact, are migrating. It's changing how many days of extreme weather we're having. And while it's still very difficult for scientists to pinpoint whether any single event that we see is caused by climate change or would have happened with natural variation, the trends that we see already suggest that climate change is reshaping our planet, here and now. And it's threatening the homes of hundreds of thousands of people. So that's what's happening now. And this is still a big open question. That is, what does happen next? What will all of this warming and carbon do to our planet in the future? Will winter turn into summer? Will sea levels rise enough to take out whole countries? Will weather patterns change so drastically that croplands turn into deserts? Will this happen?
Every New York City neighborhood you'll see in this video will be underwater if we don't stop climate change.
How much time do we have? How much time does the human race have?
I can't imagine there will be a human on the planet in 10 years.
Whoa, 10 years? Will we even have time to do science versus that little guy in the refrigerator? How does the light turn on and off? So much to do. Okay, so there's no credible evidence that we'll all be dead in 10 years. But there are real questions about what the world will look like in 100 or 200 years. To sort through those questions, we're now going to meet someone whose job it is to predict the future.
In order to find David Pearce, I'm walking on Downwind Way. Which is funny because it sounds like a fart. David. Hello.
David Pearce is also at Scripps. He's just across the road from Ralph Keeling.
You counted on your website your research interests as total world domination via long-range climate predictions. Just wondering how that was going so far.
Probably about 5% accomplished so far. No, yeah. So I think you have to keep a sense of humor in climate research because sometimes you feel like there's a buzzard of doom sitting on everyone's shoulder.
So what is David doing that has turned him into a buzzard of doom? David is a climate modeller, which means he's gaming out our future using climate models. A climate model is a computer-generated simulation of all the major processes that drive our climate. This is heat coming from the sun, winds moving that heat around, greenhouse gases trapping that heat, oceans absorbing that heat. They even include how water gets around in all its various forms, ice, rain, and water vapour. And what gets plugged into the models are real observations that we've made about the climate, like those measurements from the Keelings, as well as temperature gauges, satellite data, and even information that we can squeeze out of ice cores, which is very old ice. So combining our understanding of how climate processes work along with our real data, the model will spit out a prediction of what the future will hold, say if we stop using fossil fuels today or if we keep burning fossil fuels the way we do now. When you hear a climate change prediction about our future, chances are it came from these climate models. And there are more than 40 different climate models made from teams around the world. All these models are based on the same basic ideas about what drives climate change, but they crunch their numbers in slightly different ways. To see how good the models are, scientists can start the model at the very beginning of the 20th century and run them to make sure they accurately simulate the changes to our climate that we've already seen. And they more or less do.
Do you have a model up on your screen that we can have a look at?
And I just have a few of them here. But let's look at one. This is, oh, actually, you're from Australia. Let's go to the Australian model.
Sure.
No, David isn't hacking into the mainframe here. He's actually pulling up one climate model made by Australian scientists. A map of the world pops up on his screen, and it's pretty pixelated. It looks a bit like a 90s video game. And each of these pixels represents a patch of the ocean or land that's the size of Connecticut.
So this model has been run starting probably in about 1850 to 1880, but then it goes all the way through year 2100. So we can see what could happen in the future.
Okay, so first up, I wanted to use these models to see how temperature will change in the future. I wanted to know what would happen if we just keep burning fossil fuels the way we are now. So David pulls up a map of the world in the 19th century. The map is colour-coded. There's red bits where it's warm, like the Australian desert, while the Arctic is blue. And then David runs the model to 2100.
And then there's a slow trend such that overall things get somewhat warmer.
The screen gets redder. It shows a world that is around 4.5 degrees Celsius warmer than today. That's around 8 Fahrenheit. But of course, this is just one model. When you look at more than 40 models, which is what the IPCC does, the models differ slightly in their predictions by about 1 degree Celsius in either direction.
So it's not like winter will turn into summer, but an extra 5 Celsius on top of summer is a lot, and that's on average. What we consider to be a historically warm July now will be distinctly on the cold side for an average July by about 2060.
In fact, 5 degrees is an average, which means it includes the temperature over the ocean, which tends to be cooler than the rest of the planet. And David says this will likely mean more extreme weather events.
Heat waves are going to be worse. Downpours are going to be worse. Flooding is going to be worse. Droughts are going to be worse. I mean, it's the extremes where you really see the biggest expression of climate change.
And to put this into perspective, when we look far, far back into our planet's history, when the temperature dropped by 5 degrees Celsius, it was the difference between being in an ice age and not. So, when it comes to predicting the temperature in the future, the models are pretty unanimous. They all predict a very similar world. We can say with a lot of certainty that if we keep living the way we are now, temperatures will rise by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But what is harder to model is what will that temperature bump mean for, say, sea level rise?
How high will it get?
I think that's an area in active research.
An area of active research. That's kind of scientist speak for... Now, to be clear, this is not the kind of you do when someone asks you, what's the capital of Burundi? Which is Bujumbura, by the way. It means that scientists are actively studying this, but acknowledging that there are gaps in what they know. Still, for brevity, we're just going to call these uncertainties. Now, it's not all when it comes to sea level rising. We know the basic reasons why sea levels rise, including that water expands when it heats and that ice sheets melt, trickling water into the ocean. In fact, recently, the glaciers and ice sheets have been melting by an average of 549 gigatons each year. We also know how much sea levels have risen in the past 25 years or so. Since 1993, global sea levels have gone up by 3 inches. But what we don't know is how quickly they will rise in the future. And one reason we don't know this is because we can't accurately predict one of the causes of sea level rise: how exactly the ice sheets will melt. Because these ice sheets don't melt predictably like ice on a sidewalk. It's not all one slow melt. One of the ways that these big boys lose mass is when huge chunks of ice crack. Once a crack forms, melting water can pour into it and bust its way down, eventually breaking that cracked off ice and sending it into the ocean. This is the sound of a big chunk of ice breaking apart from Greenland. And when we say big, we mean big. In 2013, an iceberg the size of Singapore that went by the alias B31 broke loose from Antarctica. As it struck out into the water, its surface area increased, exposing it to more heat and causing it to melt faster. But it's hard to know how often this has happened and whether it's been happening more often recently. We reached out to a couple of glaciologists to find out, and they told us that part of the problem is that we've only been properly monitoring them since the 1970s. But while there isn't great data on that, here's some good news. We got a really great voicemail from one of the glaciologists. His name is Jason Box.
Have a nice day. Or as I like to say, have an ice day.
Just two nerds hanging out. Anyway, the point is, we don't know how much ice has broken off these big boys in the past century, and so it's actually very difficult to predict how and when the cracks will form in the future. Here's David again.
And if big pieces of the glaciers start falling off Antarctica, basically, you can get a very rapid rise in sea level. And you actually, to me...
But what's the chance of that really happening in, say, the next 100 years?
I would say no one knows exactly what those chances are. I mean, it's enough to be thinking about and concerned about, but I think that's an area in active research.
In other words... And these ice sheets are very important. Perhaps one of the worst-case scenarios was calculated in a paper published in 2016, and it predicted that in less than 500 years, we could have a 15-metre sea level rise. That's almost 50 feet. That would mean saying goodbye to Miami, Shanghai, and half of Brooklyn. It means in 500 years, we'd have lost whole countries. Bangladesh and the Netherlands, gone. That prediction was just from one paper, though. The most recent IPCC report ultimately said that our understanding here was so limited that they couldn't make conclusions on how much the sea level would rise due to melting ice sheets. So when it comes to predicting sea level rise, there's a lot we don't know. It's going up, but how quickly it will rise and by how much, that's an area of active research. So... And then there are other things that scientists know even less about, like how climate change will affect the currents moving around our ocean and what that means for us. There's this one big conveyor belt of water which chugs around the world. It comes up from the tropics, whooshing past the east coast of the United States and then shooting up to Iceland and Greenland.
Well, it's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC.
AMOC, amok.
Yes, it's gone amok.
The AMOC. Many Americans know one part of it as the Gulf Stream, and it's important because it transports warm water around the world, particularly from the tropics up to Europe, giving Europe its relatively warm winters. The AMOC's driving force is partly set by how salty the water is around it. And with that melting ice we just talked about pouring fresh water into the salty oceans, it could slow the AMOC down. And it's believed that if the AMOC collapsed completely, thanks to a warming planet, it could affect weather patterns around the world, with drastic impacts on agriculture. It's thought that in the past, when the AMOC did start slowing down, it got really cold in parts of the world.
In fact, there is a very bad movie about this, I think called The Day After Tomorrow.
That's a good movie.
Where the theory there was that the AMOC would suddenly stop, and so Northern Europe and so on would instantly freeze. Now, I think it had some great pictures of people running down the street and freezing in their tracks. Happily, the real climate does not work that quickly.
Hedlund had some pretty convincing data. They've asked me to feed it into my paleoclimate model to track the next set of events. I think we're on the verge of a major climate shift.
Getting back to the real science, though, there's a lot of uncertainty here. A 2016 paper that looked at almost 500 studies on the AMOC said that we needed more data to accurately model it. They ultimately concluded that the best climate models we have do not predict that the AMOC will collapse. But they did say it would probably slow down. Ultimately, David says,
That's an area in active research.
so you can count the AMOC as another. Yes, like the ice sheets, we simply don't have enough data to know exactly how the AMOC is working or how to model it in the future. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, we would need to have been keeping track of it for, quote, decades to properly characterize and monitor the AMOC, end quote. Amidst all of these what have we learnt? When it comes to climate change, yes, there are uncertainties, like how high sea levels will rise by the end of the century and how slow the AMOC will get. But there are also certainties, things that scientists have worked out, like that carbon dioxide is rising, that we, humans, did it, and that it's causing the average temperature of our planet to rise. If we keep living the way we are now, all climate models show that temperatures will keep rising. And what we're seeing around the world right now, it is part of a predicted trend. Just before Ralph Keeling took his samples back to the lab, I asked him,
Do you ever get a bit philosophical about looking out the horizon?
Well, yeah, I don't need to be looking at the horizon to get philosophical. I mean, I guess the point when I get philosophical is when I'm with my children. The world they live in is changing fast, and some of the things they are growing up with and are seeing now will be gone when they're grown.
Things like which things?
Well, like you could see that a town up in the mountains here, the trees are dying. And you can see that trees further down the slope have been dying. We can't possibly pretend that we're going to be preserving the world in a way that's pristine. It would be nice to do that, but we're way too far into this to pretend that we're not going to have profound changes on the planet happening.
hang on a second. Our future is not set in stone. And this takes us to the final uncertainty that we have to talk about. And it's the biggest uncertainty of all, in fact. And that is, what will humans do next? David Pearce, our buzzard of doom, says that when you look at the climate models, the biggest uncertainty in how fast our world will warm is our actions. Like how much carbon dioxide we choose to keep emitting.
So the biggest source of uncertainty by the end of the century is what we do as a society. So you see, it's a funny way of thinking about uncertainty. People might say it's uncertain what I will eat on Friday, but I determine when I'm going to eat on Friday. So to me, it seems like a very weird definition of uncertainty because we're controlling it. We're controlling the major source of uncertainty by our actions.
Amidst all this, then, let's leave the final words to one of the greatest philosophers of our time, Captain Planet.
The power is yours.
Oh, and just to be clear, by the power is yours, the yours is obviously the most powerful governments in the world. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Captain Planet, he's our hero, gonna take pollution.
Oh, and if they want to change things, they better move bloody fast. Just a few weeks ago, in October 2018, the IPCC released a new report saying we only have a few decades to drastically limit our carbon emissions to avoid climate change catastrophe. Okay, cool. Back to the music.
But of course, it really would make a difference if everyone out there understood the science on climate change.
Magnified, and it's fighting on the planet side. You'll pay for this, Captain Planet.
That's science versus climate change.
Tomorrow, our final midterm election special. We're looking at the science of immigration. This episode has been produced by me, Wendy Zuckerman, and Dr. Diane Wu, with help from Shruti Ravindran and Heather Rogers. It's been updated by Meryl Horn. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sori, production assistance from Ben Kebrick. We're edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Blythe Terrell. And a big thanks to Eric Mennel, Pat Walters, Caitlin Kenny, and Alex Bloomberg. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris, Ben Kebrick, and Meryl Horn. Sound engineering, music production, and original scoring by Bobby Lord and Emma Munger. Even more thanks to Dr. Alexander Roble, Dr. Ted Scambos, Dr. Pieter Tanz, Professor Jason Box, Associate Professor Zana Chase, Assistant Professor Martha Buckley, Sarah Shackleton, Stevie Lane, the Zuckerman family, and Joseph Lavelle Wilson. I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you tomorrow. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the last episode of our series looking into the big political issues for the upcoming midterm elections. And we're ending on the number one concern of Americans heading into the voting booth, according to a Reuters poll. And that's immigration. Just in the past week, headlines about a caravan of migrants have been whirling around the country.
A caravan of Central Americans heading to the U.S. grows by the thousands.
Images of migrants trudging north from Honduras through Mexico to the doorstep of the United States might look to many like a humanitarian crisis.
This will be the election of the caravan, and in that caravan you have some very bad people.
Since Donald Trump was elected, immigration has been a huge talking point for him. One of the first things he did while in office was institute a travel ban on predominantly Muslim countries. And across the board, he's taken steps to make it harder for many immigrants to get into the US. Just this week, Trump announced that he wants to end birthright citizenship.
Where a person comes in, has a baby, and the baby is essentially a citizen of the United States for 85 years with all of those benefits. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And it has to end.
Meanwhile, more and more science has been coming out on the effect of immigration on a country. We first released this episode last year, and since then there have been dozens of new studies. So, what you're about to hear includes that new research. Here it is. Today, we're pitting facts against foreigners as we give you science versus immigration.
Okay, what I'm looking at, is that the wall? I think that's the wall. Yeah, it's a bloody big fence. Restricted area, no trespass. I'm about 20 meters from the wall. I can't even, why am I so nervous? Because I'm in a restricted area, that's why I'm nervous. Okay, here it is. This is the wall. This is what it's about. This is the border between America and Mexico. I kicked the wall, just so you could hear it. The wall says "Made in the USA."
I'm at the border between the US and Mexico, about an hour's drive away from San Diego. And despite what you might hear in the news, and as you just heard, on this part of the border, there's already a wall. It's about 20 feet tall and is made of big metal posts and a strong wire mesh. Within minutes of kicking it, Border Patrol arrived in a white SUV.
Oh. How you doing? Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you.
I was just looking for the Friendship Monument.
Not allowed to actually come up to this fence, really.
Oh, okay, sorry.
All right.
A fence? Wall, fence? I guess it's more of a wence. Anyway, a recent Pew survey found that around 35% of Americans want a longer wence, one that runs the full length of the border with Mexico. And the goal is to stop immigrants from crossing that border and flooding the United States. So on today's show, we're talking about what happens when immigrants do get into the US. Specifically, 1, what are all these immigrants doing to the economy? Like, are they taking American jobs? And 2, are they driving up the crime rate? When it comes to immigration, there's a lot of opinions. But then there's science. There are over 40 million people living in the US today who were born in other countries. Some came here legally, some didn't. But in total, they make up more than 1 in 8 people in the US population. And just a quick note, before you go thinking that because of this accent I must love immigrants, here's a psych out. I'm actually a US citizen. That's right, I was born in California. The accent is fake. No, the accent's actually real.
But I was born here, raised in Australia. Funnily enough, though, being born in the US is enough to class me as an American, not only to Border Patrol, thankfully, but also to scientists who research immigration. So, we're going to use that definition on today's show. You're born here, you're American. That means when we say immigrant, we're talking about anyone who was born in another country and then came here. And a lot of talk in America is about undocumented versus documented immigrants. Unfortunately, much of the research doesn't make that distinction. So we'll tell you when we're talking about documented or undocumented. Otherwise, we're just talking about all immigrants. Okay, on with the show. So, if you want to find out, using science, how immigrants affect a nation or a state or a town, one way you can do that is to look at places that got rid of a whole lot of immigrants, and you can see what happened. Beginning in 2010, a bunch of US states started passing laws that made life hard for immigrants. The goal? To get undocumented people to pick up and leave. One of the strictest laws came from Alabama, and it was named Adios, Bad Hombres. No, of course it wasn't. It was called the Alabama Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act. And when it came into effect, police were required to verify people's immigration status during routine stops. Schools needed to find out the immigration status of children and their parents, and Americans were prohibited from hiring, renting housing to, and even giving rides to undocumented immigrants. Since the law was passed, it has been weakened quite a bit by the courts. But still, it was strong enough to scare off quite a lot of immigrants. Now, nobody has collected specific data on how many people in total left the state after the law was passed. But estimates using census data and the Pew Research Centre suggest that perhaps some 15,000 immigrants left. Another estimate out of the University of Alabama pegged the number at above 40,000. Let's be conservative and say thousands of immigrants left the state. Speaking of conservative, some politicians were excited about all of these people leaving. Here's Scott Beeson, who was then an Alabama state senator, speaking at a rally not long after the law was passed.
It is doing what it is supposed to do. It is putting Alabamians back to work. It is putting Alabamians first, which is the way it should be. And it is saving taxpayers untold dollars.
But is it? What really happens when an economy is stripped of its outsiders, when thousands of immigrants pack up and leave? We're heading to Alabama to find out.
Welcome to Birmingham. Local time here is about 12:47 Central Time.
From Birmingham Airport, I drove to the tiny agricultural town of Cullman with our producer Heather Rogers. We saw tractors, horses, and some cows.
Did you do something? Did you provoke the cow?
I didn't. They were provoking each other. It was like the best interview I've ever done.
We were heading to meet farmer Jeremy Calvert, who for years has employed mostly immigrants on his fruit and veggie farm. Jeremy's crops grow in the rolling hills just outside of Cullman. His family has farmed here for 6 generations, and he loves it.
There's no smell like a load of strawberries. When the weather's been dry and the berries are producing good, but the only way I know that anybody can experience that is they got to be right there at that right exact moment, because you can't bottle it up and sell it.
Jeremy's got 30 acres, and in summer, when his peach trees are heavy with fruit, he sweats over growing the perfect peach.
Nobody wants a little peach. They all have to be big and pretty, you know. Well, that means every limb on every tree has to be gone over, and it takes time and it takes hands to do it.
To get those hands, Jeremy pays $10 an hour for workers, and for at least the last decade, he's mostly hired workers from Mexico and Central America. But after Alabama's immigration law was passed, he says those workers, who he calls Spanish, became harder to find.
We noticed over a period of months and maybe a year or so, you just don't see as many Spanish folks as you once did.
And to Jeremy, the promise from politicians that losing immigrants would open up jobs for Americans didn't really pan out. He didn't get American workers in their place, and without the help, Jeremy had to pick up the slack, often working 18-hour days.
When you own the operation and the job doesn't get done, the burden falls on one person, and that's me.
Now, studies haven't been done in Alabama to see the effect of the law on farmers, but a survey done in Georgia, which is right next door, found that after a very similar law was passed, farms only had about 60% of the workers that they needed. And this is the sort of thing that Sam Addy, an economist at the University of Alabama, has been studying for years.
Those jobs and what they pay, most unemployed people in the U.S. will not take those jobs.
Now, you might have noticed, Sam has an accent.
And yes, I am from a small country in West Africa called Ghana.
But Sam has lived in Alabama for nearly 20 years, and he was one of the economists who warned the state when Alabama's immigration law was passed that there might be a negative impact on farmers like Jeremy.
Immigrants typically go for the jobs that we shun. So the only way you can have people fill those jobs is to bring them in.
Sam points to a study from a few states over in North Carolina that found that in 2011, in the wake of the recession, there were almost 500,000 unemployed North Carolinians. But when farmers advertised for more than 6,000 job openings, only 7 American workers took those jobs and finished out the season. Yeah, only 7. And the rest of the jobs, they were filled by immigrants. And Trump seems to recognize that we need immigrants to fill some jobs. Like, curiously, he let more immigrants into the US to help work at hotels, including his own. And when it comes to farming, he has said that he wants to make it easier to let farm workers into the country. But he hasn't done anything yet. So, why do we need immigrants to fill these jobs in the first place? Like, why aren't Americans running for jobs on the farm? Well, Jeremy says that he actually used to have a lot of American workers, or what he calls white workers, on his farm. That is until the late 1990s.
We could still get your average white person then. Well, you move forward to the 2000s, and that's just not there anymore.
And the data bears some of this out. In 1990, immigrants made up just 7.5% of men working on farms. By 2012, that number had more than tripled. It's not entirely clear why these days Americans don't want to work on farms. Sam from the University of Alabama says it's partly because Americans have become more educated. More and more Americans are finishing high school and going to college. So, for the most part, they want better jobs. Farm work is also really tough, though. We heard this from researchers as well as farmers like Jeremy. He's had high school football players give it a go, and they struggled.
The ones that did make it would come back and tell me this is the hardest thing I've ever done. To run and work out on a football field in the heat of the day is one thing, but to bend your back and pick squash or pick tomatoes all day long in the rain and the heat and the cold, that's a different matter.
Conclusion. Immigrants can fill the jobs that many Americans don't want to do. In areas like farming, they're not competing for the work. But that's not true for all jobs. There are times when Americans and immigrants do compete for jobs. So what happens then? Well, let's start off with the effect on wages. That is, when immigrants come in, can it drop your pay? For this question, we spoke to Jenny Hunt, an economics professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And she, too, has an accent.
So how many passports do you have?
I have 3 passports. I have Australian, which is the one I originally had, and then I became American before I went to Canada, then I became Canadian.
Jenny helped write a major report in 2016 by the National Academy of Sciences on the economic effects of immigrants, and it's over 500 pages long, very comprehensive. It found that some people do lose out from immigration when it comes to wages. And FYI, Jenny calls Americans native-born.
There'll be winners and losers amongst the native-born.
Most research shows that people who didn't finish high school, they tend to be the biggest losers here.
We did come to the consensus that there is a negative effect of immigration on very unskilled groups of native-born workers.
To understand why, you need to know this. not everyone is competing for the same work. It mostly depends on your skills and education. So for the most part, high school dropouts are up against other high school dropouts, and people with PhDs compete with people with PhDs. And it turns out a lot of the people coming to America basically fit into two categories.
Immigrants tend to be either very highly educated or very poorly educated, much more so than the natives. For example, if you're a native-born high school graduate, you're actually not competing that much with immigrants. There actually aren't that many immigrants with exactly high school.
You can think about it like this. When a prince comes to America, he's not competing with a McDonald's worker. Well, except for in coming to America.
I have recently been placed in charge of garbage. Do you have any that requires disposal?
So it's only people who are competing with immigrants for work who might lose wages. And studies find that it's the low-income workers who are more likely to be losing out. While losing any money in your pay each week sucks, particularly if you're already not making much, it's important to know how much pay someone stands to lose from immigration. Well, this all depends on how you slice up the data, because you've really got to do some careful analysis here. Economists have to separate out the effect of immigration from other changes to the market, so studies vary. They've found that immigrants can drive down the wages of low-income earners by as much as 9%, all the way down to 0.7%. Put it all together, and the National Academy of Sciences report says that the impact of immigration on the wages of Americans overall, in the long run, is, quote, very small, end quote. On top of that, most Americans, more than 90%, do finish high school. And so, on average, they shouldn't see their wages lowered by immigration. And here's something kind of surprising. Even though some Americans might lose a little bit of their wages thanks to immigration, Jenny told us that Americans, on average, won't lose their jobs because of these newcomers.
In the US, there's really no evidence. Nobody thinks the employment rate is lowered by immigrants.
Okay, so this raises the obvious question. If there are more people and more competition, why aren't more Americans out of a job? Well, there's something else that immigrants do when they come to a country. They create jobs. Here's how it works. When new people come to the US, they buy food, gasoline, clothes, they rent apartments, they get haircuts, just like in that immigration documentary with Eddie Murphy.
Tell me how you want me to cut this. Just make it nice and neat.
And all that spending creates jobs for people who work in those businesses where immigrants spend their money.
That'll be $8.
And because of this, back in Alabama, when thousands of undocumented immigrants left, Sam Addy from the University of Alabama was worried.
The biggest thing that stared me in the face was the fact that, holy smokes, don't we realize that for every single one of them who leaves, we have less people buying stuff at our grocery stores?
And this is true of any immigrant, documented or not.
Yes, they are illegal, but their demand is real.
And he says that demand, all that spending, all those new people who want stuff, doesn't just create jobs in restaurants and barbershops, but it actually creates a cascade of new jobs.
Doctors need patients. But guess what? There has to be pharmacies on the side, roads to the pharmacies. So now we need civil engineers and builders and draftsmen and architects. So you can keep going on and on.
And when do we get to the point where we need economists?
You need them all along the line. Let me make a point.
And how do we know this? Back in 1980, this idea that growing demand creates jobs was put to the ultimate test. Around 120,000 immigrants fled Cuba on boats and landed in Florida over 6 months. Most of them headed to Miami. And this event is known as the Mariel Boat Lift.
Between midnight and noon today, 23 boats reached Key West, Florida.
So what happened to the employment rate of Americans in Miami when tens of thousands of immigrants landed there? Well, there was virtually no effect. That's according to several analyses and studies. Anyway. And when you look at studies done elsewhere, say across the US and in Denmark and Germany and Israel and Portugal, well, they find that when an area gets a ton of new immigrants, it either increases unemployment for natives by a little bit, or it does nothing at all. Which really tells us that these new people come in, boost the economy, and all of their new demand, it does create jobs. An influx of immigrants does one more thing. It also fills government purses because they get more in sales and property taxes. Sam says that by icing out undocumented workers, his state ultimately lost out. Since the law was passed, the population has grown at a much slower rate, he says, than it otherwise would have. And to Sam, this slower population growth means less people in Alabama to buy stuff and less taxes for the state.
I think we shot ourselves in the foot, and so we haven't been able to grow as much as we could have.
So how do you know that gap in the growth, how do you know that that's because of the law?
Because there is no other economic factor to explain that slow growth.
And there is a particular group of immigrants, the most highly educated immigrants, that create jobs by doing more than just buying stuff. They innovate. To track innovation, Jenny Hunt at Rutgers University looks at patents. And skilled immigrants get proportionally more of them than Americans, which, according to Jenny, juices the economy across the board.
The benefit is spread over everyone, including the low-skilled native-born workers. And we actually think that innovation not only raises wages, but it actually raises growth.
The NAS report went so far as to say that the United States prospects for long-term economic growth, quote, would be considerably dimmed without the contributions of high-skilled immigrants, end quote. Conclusion. For some people, particularly high school dropouts, immigrants can lower your wages. Still, the best science we have suggests it doesn't increase unemployment. And that's because when immigrants come, they bump up the economy, which creates new jobs. Okay, so immigrants can boost the economy. But how much do they take? And do they drive up the crime rate? That's coming up after the break.
Quentin here runs a sustainable clothing brand.
Hi there.
He's excited that his shipping company, FedEx, has set a goal of having carbon-neutral operations by 2040.
Impressive.
When an influencer tweeted about his recycled bamboo t-shirts, Quentin unexpectedly became quite popular.
I'll take it.
He uses FedEx to reach new customers around the globe while making Earth a priority. FedEx, where now meets next.
Welcome back. So we've just learnt that immigrants can boost the economy. So they give. But immigrants and their kids, they also take. They get public education, Medicaid, food assistance, and subsidised housing. And according to that National Academy of Sciences report, the one that was 500 pages long, documented immigrant households are more likely to be getting some type of welfare than American households. Add all these things up, and it makes immigrants more expensive than Americans on average. The NAS report found that the government spends hundreds to thousands of dollars on each immigrant per year. So, in the short term, immigrants might be a drain on the economy. But watch what happens when this report looked at the longer term. While immigrants might take, the American-born children of immigrants contribute more in federal, state, and local taxes than Americans who have been here for multiple generations. The children of immigrants straight up just earn more money, and so they pay more taxes than other Americans. Here's Sam Addy from the University of Alabama again, talking about that big NAS report.
Their bottom line analysis is that immigration is good for the country. That is their bottom line. When you read it, you will see it very clearly.
Yes, when the National Academy of Sciences report added it all up that immigrants compete with some workers, help out other workers, lower some wages, boost other wages, ultimately they found that, quote, immigration has an overall positive impact on long-run economic growth in the United States, end quote. Conclusion. Overall, immigrants do take, and they take a lot. But some of what they take is for their kids. And over time, those kiddos boost the American economy and pay a whole lot of taxes. Final question. Immigrants might, on average, boost the US economy. But what about the crime rates? Are they boosting those too? President Donald Trump seems to think so. Here he is speaking during the election.
The U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
And now that he's president, Donald Trump is still very much focused on the crimes that immigrants commit. And the idea that immigrants come to America and commit a lot of crimes is something that we heard in Alabama too. While we were in Cullman, Heather and I wandered into a small but packed two-chair barbershop.
Hey, hello, girls. Hello.
Where a man named Charlie Heaton has been cutting hair for decades. He knows just about everyone in town, even our farmer.
Yes, I know Jeremy Calvert.
So we had a chat.
He comes in here.
Oh, the young boy?
Yeah, Jeremy.
What kind of haircut does he get?
Regular. He gets a regular farming haircut. There you go.
The guy sitting in Charlie's chair is a cattle farmer, and he told Heather that he's not a fan of the Mexicans in his area.
Yeah, them Mexicans ain't like everybody thinks they are.
What are they like?
What they like? Yeah, them cheating, lying son of a gun.
Are all Mexicans?
No.
No, they might be a few good ones. They ain't too many
I
good
know
ones.
some good ones. I really do.
Charlie, our barber, was worried about the immigrants bringing in drugs.
The Mexicans, they sell and buy drugs a lot more.
And this idea that immigrants bring in crime is pretty common. In fact, a 2015 Pew survey said that half of all Americans think that immigrants drive up crime. So, is this true? Do immigrants commit more crimes than Americans? Well, some immigrants have entered the US without the AOK of an immigration officer. And when they do that, it is breaking US law. But a lot of people are really concerned about the crime in their neighbourhood and whether that's going up. The drugs, the robberies, the violent crimes. So, does immigration drive up that kind of crime? The first thing we tried to figure out was whether immigration means more drug crime. And it turns out, we don't really know. The research is really mixed, and that's partly because it's really hard to get any data on crime and immigration in the US. Law enforcement doesn't release info on the immigration status of people who commit crimes. But there is some research that comes from another part of the world that's also been worried a lot about immigration, and that's the UK. Brian Bell, an economist at King's College London, has looked into this. And Brian, he's more British than a cheeky Nando's. His family has lived in England for a very long time.
We've always lived in Britain. I think we've been here since 1066.
Wow. So did one of your ancestors colonise Australia, or were they sent as a convict to Australia?
I'm sure we didn't have any convicts in our family.
Brian recently studied how two large immigrant waves to the UK affected crime. The first were mainly asylum seekers who came in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They came from Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, and the former Yugoslavia. A second wave of foreigners came from the European Union.
Mainly Polish, some Hungarians, Latvians, Lithuanians. So all of the East European countries that joined the European Union in 2004.
Brian looked at how these waves of immigrants affected violent crime rates. That is, murder, assault, rape, as well as property crimes, breaking into houses, stealing cars, and shoplifting. He said that when it came to violent crimes, immigrants had no effect. And this is consistent with other work in the field.
None of these immigrant groups, and none of the immigrant groups that I've seen across any study that's been done, suggests any effect on violent crime.
But what about property crime? Well, when the Eastern Europeans came, there was no effect.
At the margin, in fact, it looks like they reduced crime in areas they went to. There was certainly no increase.
But for the asylum seekers, that first wave?
What we found was there was some small increase in property crime in areas where they went to.
And how big was the increase in property crime when you look at the refugees that came?
So it's a really small effect.
Ultimately, he found that if you had a town of 10,000 people and 100 asylum seekers moved there, the property crime rate would increase by 1.1%.
Realistically, if you lived in an area where there were a collection of asylum seekers, you wouldn't have noticed any change in the crime rate.
Now, Brian has a theory for why there was a difference between asylum seekers and the other immigrants. And that is that asylum seekers who came to the UK couldn't work while their applications for asylum were under review, while immigrants from the European Union, they could work.
And, people who have jobs tend not to commit property crime because they've worked out that working legally is a better deal than committing crime.
And Brian says that other studies have reached the same conclusion.
A study that was done in Italy using a very similar kind of approach that we did, and a study in the United States that did, again, a very similar kind of approach. Both of those studies found that, on average, there was very little effect of immigrants on crime.
The growing consensus here is that when immigrants arrive to a country, they don't increase the crime rate. In fact, neighbourhoods with more immigrants often have lower than average crime. 5 out of 6 studies published in the past year or so found no link between immigration and increased crime. And that was true for documented and undocumented immigrants. Why do you think that people are so sure that immigrants are causing crime when the evidence isn't there to show it?
In some sense, you could argue it's because we're asking different questions. What academics are asking is, what's the average effect? That's different from asking a question of, if 10 new immigrants arrive in my town, does that mean I'm definitely not going to see an increase in crime? Well, no, it doesn't, because just like if 10 new natives arrived in your town, they might be bad people and they might commit crime.
And what about Alabama? What happened to the crime when these immigrants left? Well, in 2016, researchers from Texas A&M University tracked the crime rates in Alabama from before and after the law kicked in. And they found that when the immigrants left, the violent crime rate rose and the property crime rate, it stayed about the same. I put our research to Charlie over at the barbershop in Cullman and told him that it seems like, if anything, immigrants are less likely to commit crimes.
I can see what you're saying, because if they commit crime, they're going to draw attention to themselves and they'll get deported. I can see that statistic being right.
Conclusion. The vast majority of research shows that immigrants don't bump up the crime rate.
So, when it comes to science versus immigration, does it stack up? 1. What are all these immigrants doing to the economy? Like, are they taking American jobs? For the most part, no. Immigration can lead to a little less pay for some low-income workers, especially those without a high school education. But generally, immigrants are not running people out of work, because when they come to America, they bring new demand and that creates jobs. Overall, the consensus of economists is that immigrants are good for the economy. 2, are they driving up the crime rate? No. In general, immigrants do not increase the crime rate. And in fact, they might even lower it. So bottom line, the evidence tells us that overall, immigrants are good for a country. But of course, with an accent like mine, I would say that. Okay, how's this? Overall, the science tells us that immigrants make America more prosperous. And I bet you believe me right now. That's science versus immigration. Next week, we're back to our regular Science Versus, and we're tackling CBD. Should you be taking it?
When was the first time you tried CBD?
Definitely, it was in Colorado. I felt my whole body turn into liquid. That's the best way I can put it.
This episode was produced and updated by Meryl Horn, and the original episode was produced by Heather Rogers, Shruti Ravindran, and me, Wendy Zuckerman. Caitlin Sori is our senior producer, production assistance by Ben Kiebrick. We're edited by Annie Rose Strasser and Blythe Terrell. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris and Meryl Horn. Sound engineering, music production, and original music by Bobby Lord and Emma Munger. Thanks to Dr. Anna Pildam, Professor Karis Kubrin, Assistant Professor Jorg Spencook, Professor Kristen Butcher, and Ramiro Martinez, as well as the Zuckerman family. I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the show where we pit facts against 420. On today's show, CBD. CBD is a chemical that's extracted from cannabis, and it's all the rage right now. So, I'm at a very bougie coffee shop in Brooklyn to try it out.
We are in the heart of Williamsburg.
There's lots of plants around and wicker furniture. The clientele is Brooklyn fancy. They kind of look like bankers who at some point in their lives wanted to be screenwriters. And I'm here with senior producer Caitlin Sori, who at one point in her life wanted to do hard-hitting journalism.
There's a lot of subtle geometry in the woodwork here. Have you noticed?
But she's now stuck with me talking to our very friendly barista, Will, who walked us through this new CBD craze.
Who tends to order CBD stuff?
I feel like the most open-minded people you'll ever meet here in Williamsburg, honestly.
Will told us that most of his customers add CBD to take the edge off.
If you feel stress on your shoulders, it kind of helps it drop a little bit because people think that you're going to go on this like euphoric adventure having CBD. It's like, nah, it helps you just like feel a little bit more relaxed. It's like getting a 10-minute massage, like a nice quickie and you're in and you're out.
But online, people claim this chemical can do way more than a massage. They say it reduces pain, helps with sleep, makes you lose weight, and can even clear up your acne. Here's how the menu at the coffee shop sold its benefits.
This high-potency tincture reduces stress and anxiety, pain, inflammation, and promotes balance of mind and body.
And so, Will told us that he likes to add CBD to a bunch of stuff, including his coffee.
It's like you get your boost, but you also feel a bit more relaxed at the same time.
And his smoothies.
That's why I love it. It's just so good.
And his little shots of juice.
Liquid Vitality shots.
This all sounds very chill, but this is a cannabis extract.
Is it legal?
Yeah. I believe so. I mean, we're selling it, so I think it is legal. It's everywhere. You see everywhere in Williamsburg and New York City in general, so I'm assuming so.
Okay, so we looked into this, and CBD isn't exactly legal. It's a Schedule 1 drug. The feds put it in the same category as heroin. But there is some grey area here, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, told us that they're generally not going after people who are using CBD. So...
All right, I'm going to do it in the coffee.
All right, so I'd say do a latte with cashew milk and CBD.
Done. Sold.
That's my favorite. I got you.
Okay, here goes. My first CBD.
Initial thoughts?
Oh, it tastes like, you know what? Like, I am a massive nerd and I haven't had pot that often, but it does taste a bit like pot. Are we going to be very chilled out at work today?
You're about to have the best day of your life. It all starts right here.
Okay, so it wasn't the best day of my life, but maybe I did feel a little less anxious. And this CBD taste test really got me thinking, what exactly is CBD? And how did we get here? Where a trendy barista is casually adding a cannabis extract to my morning coffee. Well, it turns out that the story about how this thing got so huge has nothing to do with Brooklyn hipsters. It was actually a matter of life and death. And that story is coming up just after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability. Welcome back. Today we're tackling CBD, a substance found in pot. And we're starting with the unlikely tale of how it went from being virtually unknown to becoming the coolest chemical around. Sorry, hydrogen peroxide. Okay, and our story starts a long way from trendy Williamsburg coffee shops. It was 2006, and in a small town in Colorado at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Paige Figge had just given birth to twin girls.
Everything was perfect. They were born healthy. Everything was awesome, and they were a joy.
Paige was settling into life with her two little girls, but then something happened to one of the twins, Charlotte, when she was only 3 months old.
I was getting her dressed, and my husband was changing her diaper, I believe, getting her dressed, and she started shaking, and she was blue and convulsing. It was terrifying. I mean, it's absolutely terrifying to see her healthy child that way.
Paige and her doctors hoped that this was just a one-off. Sometimes babies have seizures and they never happen again. But that wasn't what happened here. Charlotte started having seizures again and again, and sometimes they went for hours.
I think her longest was 4 hours long, and so they just started coming.
Years went on and it wasn't getting better. Paige sometimes took videos of the seizures for her doctors, and you can see Charlotte's entire body shaking and her eyes rolling back in her head.
It's okay, honey. Mommy's here.
Doctors gave Charlotte all these meds to stop the seizures. Paige thinks it was about 15 different drugs, and nothing worked.
We tried everything, and we tried everything by the time she was 2.5, 3 years old. Everything, and some of them multiple times.
Charlotte was eventually diagnosed with a rare form of epilepsy called Dravet syndrome. It has no cure, and it's really scary. A lot of kids with Dravet's die before they're 10 years old, and Charlotte's case was bad.
She was on oxygen. She's fed through a tube. She didn't make eye contact, and I just felt like we were keeping her body alive in between a seizure every 30 minutes.
By the time Charlotte was 5, doctors were already planning for the worst. Paige signed a do not resuscitate order for Charlotte, which meant the hospital wouldn't revive her if she stopped breathing. Paige said Charlotte was having so many seizures that she was hardly conscious, and she told Caitlin Sorey, our senior producer, about one particularly terrible night.
She never slept at that point in her life, and so her and I were in the kitchen, downstairs in the kitchen, and I was just holding her and rocking her, and she was screaming, and then she fell into a seizure, and this time the seizure, instead of going on and on for an hour or two, it just stopped, and she went lifeless in my arms, and then I just started doing CPR right there. But that's rare that it works, so it was it wasn't like, come on, Charlotte, get through this. It was me saying goodbye.
Were you almost feeling like perhaps at this point it's better if she does?
Absolutely. It was, I wanted her to be at peace. I was saying it's okay. I love you and it's going to be okay. And just to let go and just hoping she would. I mean, at that point it was just so bad. You're just hoping whatever happens after you die, go there and it's okay. And I was giving her my blessing to die.
Charlotte didn't die that night, but Paige knew she may only have a few weeks to live. and it was clear she was in pain. So Paige started hunting for something that could help her die as peacefully and painlessly as possible. And Paige figured, well, we're in Colorado, medical marijuana was legal, and cancer patients were using it for their pain. So she thought maybe marijuana could help Charlotte.
I know that sounds crazy, and I'm not this, way out there hippie mom. It was just like, whatever works.
Paige started researching marijuana, trying to figure out what strains might be good for Charlotte's pain. And she found something unexpected. Paige stumbled across some small studies from decades ago about a particular chemical in marijuana, CBD, or as it's known in the literature, cannabidiol. Now, this chemical didn't seem to get you high, but it could do something else. Something potentially amazing for Charlotte. In these small studies, CBD looked like it could prevent seizures. So Paige dives into the research to find out everything she can about CBD. She calls scientists from around the world.
I called everybody all day, and they could hear her seizing in my arms on the phone.
And it turned out that very few researchers knew anything at all about CBD and seizures. The science was kind of flimsy. But Paige had nothing to lose, so she decided to try it on Charlotte. Her next step? Finding marijuana with high levels of CBD. And this turned out to be harder than you might think. There wasn't a big market for that kind of weed.
I went to every dispensary. I called every person. I remember my last dispensary I visited. I had called them. They said, we've got this stuff. It doesn't get you high. It doesn't get you high at all. And I said, that sounds really promising. So I went down there, cloud of smoke. You could see the smoke coming out of the back room. They had smoked it. They had smoked the last little bit of this that they had. What? They wanted to see. They're like, yeah, it really doesn't get you high. And I just felt like I'm done. I'm done with all of this. And I quit in that moment.
Yeah, thanks to these bozos at the dispensary, Paige's shot at getting CBD for Charlotte went up in smoke. And Paige thought, you know what? I give up. This is never going to happen. But then, the phone rang.
One of those people I had called me, and he said, I got this guy. I'm going to send him to your house. He's a pot grower, and he knows some stuff that might interest you. I'm like, no, I'm done. I quit today. Thank you so much. And the doorbell rings.
The guy on the phone had given Paige's address to the pot grower, and now the pot guy was on her doorstep. And he was about to completely change Charlotte's life.
That man that came to my door that day was Joel Stanley.
Joel Stanley.
She was nice, but you could tell I was the pot guy. Here's another damn pot grower, right? But then we started talking, and it quickly turned into her realizing that we had exactly what she was looking for.
Joel, who kind of looks like a lost Winklevoss twin, had grown a strain of cannabis with tons of CBD in it. He did it for his small medical marijuana business that Joel had with his brothers. In fact, they all called this strain Hippie's Disappointment because it didn't get you high. So Joel starts telling Paige all of this. And then, right in front of him, Charlotte has a seizure.
So violent, just this uncontrollable shaking, eyes kind of roll back in the head. And these parents, like Paige Figge, they're so used to it. They'll continue the conversation while you're kind of sitting there in shock. You look over by the door, and there's a bag packed for the hospital. That's how these folks live.
Joel was a bit freaked out, though, and he wasn't sure about giving his pot to 5-year-old Charlotte. So he talked to his brothers about it, since they all run the business together.
I would say the brothers had a bit of a response like mine, like, wait a minute. You want to give some of our cannabis to a 5-year-old who's about to die. Hold on a second.
Joel and his brother Josh told us how stressful making this decision was. Here's Josh.
We had that conversation. Do you remember? That was right. That was what we said. What if she were to pass on from a seizure right after taking, this by coincidence? We talked about, who would get more jail time, you or me. Or Jesse or John.
Jesse and John, they're more Stanley brothers. There's 7 in total. And yes, their names all begin with J. And now, these brothers had to decide if they were going to go out on a limb to help a mum they'd only just met. They did some serious thinking and even spoke to Charlotte's doctors, who gave them the go-ahead. After all, these docs didn't have any good options left. So, the brothers ultimately decided to help. They reduced the CBD pot down to an oil, and then Paige gave it to her little girl.
And that was the moment she stopped seizing.
She just stopped.
Yep, she's having a seizure every half hour. She didn't seize for a week.
At first, Paige thought, no, this can't be the CBD.
I didn't believe it. I honestly didn't. I don't mean like I was astounded. What I mean is I didn't believe it was working.
But weeks, months went by, and while Charlotte's seizures didn't go away entirely, the difference was huge. Paige says Charlotte went from not talking and being fed via a feeding tube to running around with her siblings.
She feeds herself now. She's started school. She walks. She rides a bike. She can talk. And so she's just a kid running around. You know, she's special needs, but she's has a life again. It's just a total 180.
Charlotte, say hi. Hi. Yes. Charlotte, say mommy.
Mommy.
Oh.
The Stanley brothers ended up naming their CBD after little Charlotte. Instead of Hippie's disappointment, they called it Charlotte's Web. And this is where things really started taking off for CBD and the Stanley brothers. Once the epilepsy community got word of what CBD could do for Charlotte, desperate families with no other medical options wanted to get some. Before Charlotte's story went viral, the Stanley brothers only had a supply for about 50 people. Soon, they had a waiting list of 15,000.
We would have people that would find out where we lived, where I personally lived, and knock on the door to explain to me why their child needed to be moved up on the waiting list, and why they were worse than another.
It was impossible to keep up with any of it.
It was so heavy.
Since Charlotte's story, scientists have run several clinical trials testing if CBD can help with some kinds of epilepsy. And it can. Not in all kids, but it has a big enough effect that the FDA approved a CBD-based drug this year, and it just hit the shelves. And while the epilepsy community was getting very excited about CBD, the internet also got a hold of it. There were tales around the web of this great new chemical that didn't just cure epilepsy, but also aches and pains. Demand for this stuff was skyrocketing, and the Stanley brothers fast became one of the biggest CBD suppliers in America.
I mean, there are millions of consumers now, right? Some portion of those are reporting experiencing amazing results for one reason or another.
And people are buying it for all sorts of things, like anxiety.
That's the number one reason we see people buying now. Then number two, people are saying sleep. And then also some people are using that have cancer. Some people are using that have MS, Parkinson's,
Alzheimer's, rheumatoid arthritis,
lupus.
Before too long, Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop started spiking cocktails with CBD, and Joe Rogan was using CBD lotion for his injuries. And these claims have really snowballed. Just last year, some websites were even suggesting that CBD could treat cancer. The Stanley brothers got in trouble with the FDA for linking to a website like this. They're more careful now. But still, Josh is keen on the powers of CBD. He wants to see people taking it every day, like a vitamin.
We'd like to see this in everyone's medicine cabinet as a therapeutic, a nutritional therapeutic.
Okay. So CBD arrived on the scene as almost a miracle cure for some types of epilepsy. And now it's exploded into this phenomenon where people are using it to treat just about anything. So after the break, what can science tell us about this chemical? Will CBD live up to the hype? That's coming up.
Quentin here runs a sustainable clothing brand.
Hi there.
He's excited that his shipping company, FedEx, has set a goal of having carbon-neutral operations by 2040.
Impressive.
When an influencer tweeted about his recycled bamboo t-shirts, Quentin unexpectedly became quite popular.
I'll take it.
He uses FedEx to reach new customers around the globe while making Earth a priority. FedEx, where now meets next.
Welcome back. Before the break, we heard the story of Charlotte Figge, the girl whose recovery from severe epilepsy whipped up a frenzy around CBD. And now people say that CBD can help with all kinds of things, from pain to depression and anxiety, and even clearing up acne. And it seems kind of crazy that CBD could do all these things. But the industry and CBD fans say that they have science on their side.
Hey guys, Dr. Josh Axe here along with
They say that this extract can do all this stuff because of a complicated system in the human body that interacts with CBD. And it's called the endocannabinoid system.
Endocannabinoid system.
The endocannabinoid system is thought to play a role in a bunch of things, like regulating our immune system and even influencing our emotions. And it does this through a network of receptor sites that are found throughout our brain and our body. Now, CBD advocates say that their chemical has this amazing ability to fit into these receptor sites like a key into a lock, like Gwyneth Paltrow to a vagina egg.
We have receptors in our physiology for CBD.
This is a really big deal that we have these receptors in our body that directly bind the plant.
They say that by interacting with this complex system, CBD can make you feel better, reduce your anxiety, and dampen down inflammation. And speaking to the Stanley brothers, they told us that CBD binds to these receptors. Here's Joel.
So there's much more to understand. What we do know is that, let's say CBD for the CB2 receptor site does fit like lock and key.
All over the internet, you hear this basic idea, and it really adds scientific legitimacy to using CBD for all sorts of things. The only problem is this story, the lock and the key. For CBD, it doesn't seem to be true. Yeah, scientists have looked at this all sorts of ways, and they're like, dude, CBD is not binding to those receptors in the endocannabinoid system. Or, as researchers put it in a review paper, this idea, quote, has now been largely dismissed, end quote. The truth is, we don't know what CBD is doing. We talked about this with Kent Hutchison, a professor and neuroscientist at the University of Colorado.
So, we don't even know the mechanism yet in terms of how CBD works in the brain, right? I mean, there's maybe some hints in the literature in animals, but even that is pretty spotty.
That is kind of crazy. We really don't know even like how it would be possible.
Yeah, it's totally crazy.
So it doesn't look like CBD is latching onto these receptors. It could be affecting the endocannabinoid system in some other way, or maybe not. It's one of the many possibilities. There's just a lot science hasn't figured out yet. And while many scientists, including Kent, do think that CBD is doing something and shows promise, largely because it's helping kids like Charlotte, the research is so new that other than epilepsy, we've hardly got any clinical trials here. There's a few encouraging studies on pain, a little on mental health. And here's what Kent said when Caitlin asked him about the research on anxiety.
What's the most convincing study you've seen that CBD could help with anxiety?
So, honestly, there haven't been any convincing studies. This is the problem, right? This is where we're at. There haven't been any convincing studies yet. And I think we are waiting for that convincing evidence that actually does something helpful for people with anxiety.
And it seems like people who want science on CBD will be waiting for a little while. And this isn't just because science takes time. In the case of CBD, it has another hoop to jump. CBD is a Schedule I drug. And that means if Kent or any other scientist wants money from the US government to study it, it's really tough. There's a bunch of rules here. They can't just buy CBD online and then study its effects. Yeah, so even though I just had some CBD in my morning coffee,
as scientists, we can't touch the stuff, right? It doesn't matter how many dispensaries there are here in Boulder, Colorado. It doesn't matter that the state legalized it, 6 years ago.
That's kind of bonkers. Like, it must be so frustrating.
Oh, it's totally frustrating, right? Because, even talking to you, I'm getting a little discouraged as I realize more and more how little we know, right? But at the end of the day, we're going to see, again, maybe it works for some things, and maybe that list is not, too long after all.
What all this means is that when people sing the praises of CBD for all sorts of conditions, we really don't know how this chemical is working, and we also don't know if it's working. Because some of what people are feeling could be due to an entirely different phenomenon. That's right. Our old friend rhymes with placebo. Say it with me. Placebo. Even Joel Stanley, who made the original CBD concoction for Charlotte, acknowledges that placebo might be playing a role in the CBD mania.
Is there some placebo? Because of all of the hype and the news stories coming out about CBD for this, that, and the other reason, and the people talking on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, is there some placebo going on out there? Absolutely. There is every time something good pops up. But we shouldn't detract from all the people that are receiving genuine benefit, whether it's drastic benefit or they just feel a little bit better.
And that's a fair point. If you're using CBD and you're feeling better, that's great. But before you start adding CBD to your morning coffee and evening cocktail, there's something you should think about. How do you know what is actually in these CBD products? Because nowadays, there's scores of them on the market. And it's not like birth control. I mean, this stuff isn't tightly regulated. And this is something that Mallory Laughlin, a clinical research scientist, has thought a lot about.
I have more faith in what's in a candy bar than I have in something that people are using to treat medical conditions, primarily mental health and neurological conditions. That's insane.
Mallory just did a study with her colleagues from the Institute for Research on Cannabinoids. They analysed what was inside over 80 CBD products. And so, what did they find?
Oh, the overwhelming majority were not accurately labeled.
70% had labels that didn't match the stuff inside. Yeah, 70%. They either had too much or too little CBD in them. And while that's not great, what is perhaps more concerning is that 1 in 5 of the products had some cheeky THC in them. This is the psychoactive chemical in weed that gets people high and gives them the munchies. It's probably not something you want in your coffee before work, unless you're running a $1 billion electric car empire. But seriously, Mallory told us about this one report of a few kids who are acting funny after taking CBD for epilepsy.
The doctors tested them and they were positive for THC, and so they were intoxicated.
They were high.
They were high. Yeah.
Oh.
And the parents thought they were giving them pure CBD. They thought they were treating them. They were giving them something non-intoxicating, so they weren't expecting their kid to get high. And yeah.
Yeah, THC in your CBD, it can happen. Now, one thing to note about Mallory's research is that her team got funding from the weed industry. But the findings do hold up. When the FDA did a similar analysis a few years ago, they also found a few products of CBD had some wacky tobacco snuck in. Okay, so that's one risk. Getting high when you'd rather not be. And what if you're just getting CBD? Is that safe? Well, while we haven't followed people who use CBD in the long term, from the studies we do have, it doesn't have serious side effects. In the clinical trials, some people got diarrhea, nausea, or felt tired. When I took it, I did get sleepy. I had a nice nap. CBD, more like CBZ. Oh, geez. Anyway, there is also evidence that sometimes CBD can interact with other medications, things like antidepressants and some blood thinners.
From what we're seeing clinically, we're not seeing anything too bad, I guess I'd say. But again, we don't know. There's not enough studies on this for, time will tell. But yeah, folks should definitely be aware.
At the end of the day, CBD does seem pretty safe, but it's still early days, so it's tough to know for sure. So when it comes to CBD, does it stack up? Well, CBD can really help some people with epilepsy, which is pretty amazing. So we know that this chemical is doing something to our brains. But we're waiting on hard data for a lot of the other claims about anxiety and sleep and pain and everything else that people are using CBD for. Here's my prediction, though. Like every other wonder drug before it, CBD will probably turn out to work for some people, for some things. Maybe sleep, maybe anxiety, maybe it'll just end up helping kids like Charlotte. Staring into the crystal ball a year from now, I don't reckon you'll be so jazzed about adding CBD to your coffee. There will be a new thing in town. And, like always, we'll be here to rain on your parade. That's Science versus CBD. Hey, Caitlin, sorry.
Hey, Wendy.
So how many citations in this week's episode?
Over 100.
Ooh, we cracked the centennial?
Sure.
It's been a long week. If people want to read these citations, where should they go?
They can go to the show notes in your podcast app. You can just click on it and you'll see the transcript right there, or you can go to the website, scienceversus.show.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks, Wendy.
This episode was produced by Caitlin Sori with help from me, Wendy Zuckerman, along with Rose Rimler, Meryl Horn and Odelia Rubin. We're edited by Blythe Terrell with help from Caitlin Kenny. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Mix and sound design by Emma Munger. Music written by Emma Munger and Bobby Lord. A huge thanks to Professor Elizabeth Teal, Professor Cinnamon Bidwell, Professor Celia Morgan, Associate Professor Ziva Cooper, and Associate Professor Didier Houtras Aswad, as well as Frank Lopez, Joseph Lavelle Wilson, and the Zuckerman family. Next week, the 7-minute workout. Can you work off that Thanksgiving turkey in just 7 minutes?
I'm not in the mood to work out.
I'm in the mood to be a whinger.
There's no whinging allowed in the 7-minute workout. There's simply no time.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and this is Science Versus from Gimlet Media, the show that pits facts against fitness. And today, we're going to play a little game called Is It a Load of Crock?
Is it a load of crock?
Crock.
All right.
And we're going to be tackling the 7-minute workout to find out if it's a load of crock or not. This workout goes for just 7 minutes, and people say it can trim you down, pump up your muscles, boost your energy, and even extend your life. When the New York Times wrote about it, this workout went viral. So, is it a load of crock? And my first thought when I heard about this workout was that it sounds like rubbish. I mean, 7 minutes is just too short. I go to the toilet for longer than 7 minutes. It sounds like one of those hack your life fads that is too good to be true. But this idea that all you need for a good workout is 7 minutes, it's just so tantalizing that we had to find out more. And I figured I should try it myself. So, Science Versus producer Rose Rimler coached me through it. And she had her work cut out for her.
Ugh. It doesn't sound like you're in the mood to work out.
No, I'm not in the mood to work out. I'm in the mood to be a whinger.
There's no whinging allowed in the 7-minute workout. There's simply no time.
Okay, Rose is going to walk me through the original 7-minute workout. Get your headbands out.
So all you need is the floor, the wall, and a chair.
Okay.
The first thing you're going to do is jumping jacks.
Star jumps, as we call them in Australia.
That's crazy, but okay. Star jumps, then wall sits, push-ups, sit-ups. You step up onto a chair, you do squat, tricep dip, planks, running in place with high knees, lunges, push-up with rotation, then you do side plank.
Okay.
Are you gonna give it your best shot?
I am gonna give it my best shot. Here's the catch. Giving the 7-minute workout your best shot means that you have to go at what's called high intensity. This is no casual jog. You've got to go hard. And there's a handy test with a stamp of approval from the CDC that lets you know if you're going hard enough. Here's Rose again.
So for high intensity, you should not be able to have like an easygoing conversation. You should not be able to sing.
Okay, so we need to get to the point where I'm like huffing and puffing, not singing Journey.
Go. Star jumps.
Okay. Just a lonely girl. All right, so I'm not going fast enough. Living in a lonely world. Okay.
Well, could you do star jumps any faster? You look like the curtain things at a car wash.
Thank you.
So while I put myself through this, let's talk to an expert to find out if this 7-minute workout does anything.
Hello, Jeff speaking.
Hi, Jeff speaking.
Hi, Wendy.
Jeff Coombs is a professor at the University of Queensland in Australia. He's been studying exercise since the 90s and has helped write a few reviews rounding up the research on short, intense workouts, like the 7-minute workout. So, my first question for him is about one of the most common reasons that people do any exercise: to lose weight. And so, can it help you lose weight?
Unfortunately, the answer is no. That amount of exercise is not going to burn enough calories to make a big difference.
Yeah, this weight loss claim is a bit of a crock. Although a few studies have found that some people do see a little bit of weight loss on this kind of workout, exercise, just generally speaking, isn't great for losing weight. Sorry, weight is more about what you put in than what you put out. Check out our obesity episode for more on that. Okay, so the 7-minute workout isn't great for weight loss. But what about those other promises? That the 7-minute workout can make you fitter and healthier? Well, Jeff says, yes, it actually can.
Definitely, the 7-minute workout is going to make you stronger, make your bones better, make your heart function better.
Really?
Yes. And if you can enjoy it, and you keep doing it, then it's certainly going to be effective.
I was really surprised, but there are a bunch of studies that show that short, high-intensity workouts are really good for you. They can improve the health of your heart, lungs, and even your sensitivity to insulin, which can help prevent diabetes. So the science is telling us that short, intense workouts are really good for you. And while it is very tricky to compare different kinds of workouts, Jeff reckons that you're probably better off working really hard for just 7 minutes than doing something easier for 20 minutes, something like walking.
Exactly. If you wanted to get the most out of your workout, then a 7-minute workout is going to be better for you.
But how is this possible? Like, how can just 7 minutes of exercise be so good for you? Well, scientists have known for a long time that exercise trains your body to be more efficient at doing a bunch of things, like using oxygen, sending blood around the body, and regulating your blood sugar. And scientists used to think that the best way to trigger these changes was to exercise for longer. So the more exercise you do, the more benefit you get. It's only recently that we discovered that you don't have to work out for that long to get these benefits, as long as you work hard enough, at high intensity.
Last chance to try Journey. Small town girl, living in a lonely world. All right, done. That's a 7-minute workout. How do you feel?
Pooped. That's actually quite a good workout.
Okay, but there is a little bit of fad in this 7-minute workout, besides the fact that you're not likely to get shredded. And that is this. There's nothing special about doing this exact routine or working for exactly 7 minutes. Studies have looked at different high-intensity workouts for different lengths of time, and all kinds of things work. So, for example, one study found that people doing several minutes of cycling with these short bursts of pedaling as fast as they could, well, they improved about as much as a group that cycled at a more relaxed pace for 45 minutes. A couple of minutes versus 45. Kind of amazing, right? But remember here, the key is to work hard. No singing.
Is it a load of crock?
Crock.
All right.
Well, for the 7-minute workout, no, it's not.
Why is there a cat making an appearance?
Well, it's not a croc, it's a cat.
The opposite of a crocodile is not a cat.
Oh, fuck.
That's science versus the 7-minute workout. This episode was produced by Rose Rimler with help from me, Wendy Zuckerman, along with Meryl Horn and Odelia Rubin. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sori. We're edited by Blythe Terrell, fact-checking by Michelle Harris, mix and sound design by Emma Munger, music written by Emma Munger and Bobby Lord. Recording assistance from Jack McDonnell. For this episode, we also spoke to Martin Gabala, Chris Jordan, Catherine Weston, Dan Schmidt, and others. Thank you so much for your help. I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and this is Science Versus from Gimlet Media, the show that pits facts against pharaohs. Today we're asking, how did the Egyptian pyramids
Piss break.
get built? Some people say that the pyramids couldn't have been a purely human achievement, that something else, maybe even aliens, had to have stepped in to help out. Which, okay, sounds pretty silly, but stick with us. Because the more we learned about how impressive the pyramids are, the more we were like, huh. So, producer Rose Rimler and I went on a bit of a discount tour using Google Earth. We sent the little avatar down to the pyramids so we could see them for ourselves. Can we go in closer?
Yeah, we can drop the little guy. I love dropping the little guy.
Whoa!
Here we go, into the map. Oh, wait, this is the wrong pyramid. Let's go out of the map. Out of the map.
Rose wanted to show me the biggest, baddest pyramid of them all, appropriately called the Great Pyramid.
Okay, so here we are at the foot of the Great Pyramid.
That's huge.
It's taller than the Statue of Liberty.
So the rocks are about the size of, about the height of like your hip or something.
Just about, yeah. So all these blocks, there's over 2 million blocks that make up this pyramid. And on average, they weigh like 2 tons apiece. Some of them came from hundreds of miles away. And yet they're so precise. The sides of the Great Pyramid are even to within like a few inches.
Really?
Yeah. They are almost perfect.
That's crazy.
And they're almost perfectly straight going along the north-south axis and the east-west axis.
Okay, so what did humans have back then, like to build such a structure? Nothing. Not even steel, right?
They didn't have steel. They didn't even really have iron. They didn't use wheels, like carts and wheels.
No wheels yet?
No
wheels yet.
Everything we think we need to have a big, stable building that would last a long time, they didn't have any of that.
And Rose told me that the pyramids aren't just huge piles of rocks. They have secret rooms, passageways, and mysterious shafts cut through 200 feet of stone. And yet, this was all put together more than 4,000 years ago, before geometry as we know it even existed. And the fact that they did this with no modern technology to work with has many questioning, could the ancient Egyptians really have done this on their own? So this idea has been bubbling away for decades. And it's that aliens had a hand in building the pyramids and other impressive ancient structures. And this idea has gotten to be so mainstream that archaeologists told us they hear it all the time. There's even a TV show about it called Ancient Aliens. It's just finished its 13th season, and on average, it gets more than 1 million viewers each episode.
Since the dawn of civilization, mankind has credited its origins to gods and other visitors from the stars.
So today we're asking, where did this idea come from? Why do people believe it? And is there any reason to think it's true? Because even if you don't believe that aliens were mingling with the ancient Egyptians, you do have to wonder, how did they pull this off? We're drinking from the sarcophagus and unlocking the secrets of the mummy's tomb. Because when it comes to ancient aliens, there's a lot of... Whoa! But then there's science. Science versus Ancient Aliens is coming up just after the break. This episode is brought to you by FedEx. FedEx delivers more than just packages. They're working toward delivering a more sustainable future. This initiative is called Priority Earth, and the goal is to reach carbon-neutral operations by 2040. FedEx says they're also starting to modernize its fleet by adding zero-emission electric vehicles and creating more recyclable packaging. Priority Earth is the most important delivery FedEx is making yet, because it's an address we all share, Earth. FedEx, where now meets next. To learn more, visit fedex.com/sustainability. Welcome back. Today we're talking about the Egyptian pyramids, and we're asking, how on earth did they get built? Perhaps something not of this earth helped the Egyptians out. As we started diving into the research for this, we started wondering where this idea of ancient aliens even came from. It seems like it should be so fringe, but this has become a cultural phenomenon. And it turns out that you can basically trace the idea of ancient aliens back to one man.
My name is Erik van Däniken. I am Swiss, I'm a writer, and I have published so far 41 books, all about the same subject. I speak about extraterrestrials who visited our planet some thousands of years ago.
Are you the reason that people think the aliens helped build the pyramids?
I think so, yes.
Erik is in his 80s now, and he kind of looks like William Shatner's long-lost Swiss cousin. And Erik told us that his path to becoming the grandfather of ancient aliens started when he was a teenager in the 1950s.
I visited the pyramid as an 18-year-old young man.
And what did you think about them when you first saw them?
The first time you're just impressed, and you have a lot of questions. And later in your life, you come on with more and more scientific questions.
Scientific questions? Questions like, who was living around Egypt thousands of years ago? And were they smart enough to design a structure as complicated as the pyramids? Erik thought, surely not.
The planning is too complicated to plan such a complicated building with so much rooms, shafts, corridors, etc.
So Erik starts looking around for answers, and there are a couple of things that fed into what happened next. For one, the space race was ramping up. And so people were starting to realize the possibilities of space travel and even alien contact. Erik thought, well, if humans have figured out how to fly around in space, then maybe aliens figured it out long ago. So could it be that thousands of years ago they stopped by and lent a hand with building stuff like the pyramids? After all, many of these ancient civilizations had stories of gods that came from the sky. And so Erik thought maybe these gods are actually aliens from Pharaoh away.
Now just imagine Stone Age people see how a vehicle descends from the clouds with smoke and fire and trembling and now loud noise. And they have no idea of technology. So they believed, erroneously, that this must be some gods. All these gods have come from the sky.
As Eric was developing these ideas, he was working as a hotel manager in Switzerland. But by the mid-60s, he had a manuscript. He sent his work around to publishers, but they all rejected it. And so it sat on the shelf. Until a guest showed up at the hotel and the two got to talking. And he was very interested in Eric's ideas.
And one day, this man said to me, Eric, why don't you write a book? And I said to him, I have a manuscript, but nobody will publish it. And he said, I have an idea. I know a big publisher in Germany. And he simply phoned this man and he said to him, listen, I'm here in Switzerland in a hotel, and there's the hotel manager, and he has written a complete crazy book. But the man itself is not crazy. You should listen to him. And that was the beginning, the start of Chariots of the Gods.
Chariots of the Gods. It was published in 1968 and was a big success, ultimately selling millions of copies and making the New York Times bestseller list. It was so popular that it was made into a film which was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary.
These stone masses were transported from a quarry on the far banks of the Nile at a time when men had neither cranes nor trucks. Ha!
The movie even aired in schools to help kids understand science. All around the world, people were going nuts for it. And so Eric kept honking his ancient alien horn, just like a Tutankhamun. He went on to write 40 more books and gained disciples along the way, some of whom wrote their own books. And so for decades, this idea has spread and spread. You can find people talking about it all over the internet. And of course, there's the Ancient Aliens show on the History Channel. Eric's a regular on it, by the way. And Eric, why do you think this idea really took off and your book was so popular? What do you think it tapped into?
This made people think. They say, hey, what's if he's right? We should look at this possibility. And that's the fascination of a story.
Once people know about how impressive the pyramids are, how precise, how intricate they are inside, and how few tools the ancient Egyptians had to do all this, Eric's ideas do plant a seed. What if he's right? So that's what we're going to figure out today. Were ancient Egyptians capable of designing the pyramids? And if they were, how did they do it? Let's start with that first question. That is, were they smart enough to plan the complicated and precise architecture of the pyramids?
I'm a paleoanthropologist and I focus on the evolution of human cognition.
And so if you were to tell like a 3-year-old child, what do you study? What would you say?
I would say that I study how people came to be as smart as they are.
This is Shelby Putt, a researcher at the Stone Age Institute. Yes, the Stone Age Institute. It's where Pebbles and Bam Bam went to college. Just kidding. It's a research institution in Indiana. And Shelby says that it's a bit tough to know how powerful our brains were thousands of years ago.
The problem is brains don't fossilize, right?
Brains don't fossilize, but bones do. And Shelby says that you can learn a lot from looking at a fossilized skull. You see, as our ancestors evolved, their skulls got bigger and bigger, suggesting their brains were getting larger too. And this happened over millions of years.
Around 300,000 years ago, we see the first evidence of modern Homo sapiens. And after this point, people have normal-looking skulls.
Our skulls have been the same size for a long time, at least 100,000 years. And the Great Pyramid is a measly 4,500 years old. Now, this suggests that humans have had the same brain power since way before the pyramids were built. Now, when it comes to smarts, brain size isn't everything, but it is an important clue. So if you were able to go back in time and to like steal a baby from ancient Egypt and then you brought them to today and like raised them, would that baby stick out in some way? Would it fit in when it grew up?
They would not stick out at all. They would be just a completely normal person. Yes, completely normal in intelligence and in the way they look. They would be just a normal person.
Wow, so 4,000 years ago, we were really the same people that we are right now.
Absolutely.
And we know that the ancient Egyptians of that time weren't dumb cave people. In fact, they had a pretty complex society. They played music, brewed beer, laid out cities, played board games, couples could get divorced, and women could own their own property. So yeah, if they could do all that, Shelby's like, surely they could map out the pyramids.
The fact is, they are modern people with modern intelligence, and we all in there have the capability of working together to accomplish something like this.
But even if the ancient Egyptians had the brain power to dream up the pyramids, how did they turn those dreams into reality? How did people transport heavy blocks from hundreds of miles away without wheels? How did they build a structure so tall that it dwarfs modern buildings and it has lasted for thousands of years? An amazing new discovery cracks the case of the pyramids wide open. And it's coming up after the break. Welcome back. So we just heard that as best as science can tell, ancient Egyptians were smart enough to architecturally design the pyramids. But the question remains as to how they actually built them. And getting to the bottom of this hasn't been easy.
Archaeological information is kind of like a homicide detective. You know, there's bloody socks on the floor, you know, there's muddy tracks going. You have to infer what happened.
This is Mark Lehner, and he's one of the top Egyptologists in the world. And even though Mark's been studying the pyramids for decades, he still remembers walking into the main chamber of the Great Pyramid for the first time. It was back when he was just a tourist.
The acoustics are amazing in there. They resonate. And so you can find just the right chant to get the thing vibrating like a big pipe organ. So that's pretty cool. Really amazing. And still, when I go in there, I can find just the right resonance to make it sort of start, you know, whoom, 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 whoom.
What's funny, though, is that Mark first got interested in the pyramids because he was a little woo, 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 wobbly, woo. Anyway, back in the 1970s, Mark believed that ancient Egyptians didn't build the pyramids alone. He didn't think it was aliens, but the lost civilization of Atlantis.
And yeah, my belief hung in there really strong.
That was until Mark started really studying the pyramids, going on trips to Egypt, sifting through artifacts. And then one day he realized that this Atlantis thing, it just didn't add up.
The whole thing had slipped away from me like a glacier separating. And I didn't believe that anymore.
So now he didn't believe that the Atlanteans helped build the pyramids, but he still didn't know how the ancient Egyptians did it. And one question that really puzzled him was this. He'd learnt that a lot of the stone from the pyramid actually came from nearby, but the ancient Egyptians still needed to truck heavy granite from very far away.
Yeah, the granite came from 600 kilometers away. How did they do that?
Well, over the past few decades, Cairo has been doing a lot of construction around the city, like installing a new sewer system, which meant they had to dig. And when archaeologists heard about that, their ears pricked up. Because, you know, archaeologists love digging. Now, during these digs, they found the remains of ancient docks, harbours, and canals. These canals went all through the city and up to the Nile River, which connected to quarries filled with granite and other stones.
Now, here's the cool thing. They actually cut all the way to the foot of the pyramid.
Yeah, right up to the pyramids. And what this suggested was that the ancient Egyptians were moving enormous stones hundreds of miles by stacking them on boats and then rowing them through the canals. So Mark had all these clues about how the river worked and then the canals. And then, a few years ago, a team of archaeologists hit the jackpot, their most concrete evidence yet. They found fragments of an ancient diary written on papyrus by a middle manager type who actually worked on the pyramids. And this guy described exactly how they moved the stones day by day.
Morning, we loaded our boats. Afternoon, we spent the time sailing to Giza. Evening, we docked. Morning, we're dragging blocks to the pyramid. Literally, day by day, it was just like, boom, opening a window. The next best thing to being there, which I've often wanted to do. I've often thought I would love to be here just for 5 minutes, 10, 15, just to see it. These papyri were the next best thing.
Papyri. Yep, it's the plural of papyrus. You should try it in a sentence. Like, this bowl of papyri really makes the whole house smell like Christmas. Oh, no, that's potpourri. Anyway, these papyri describe teams of 40 or so men piling boats high with stones and then rowing them straight to the building site. So roads? They didn't need roads, or trucks, or even wheels. They had the Nile. Okay, so now we know exactly how they moved these huge stones hundreds of miles to get to the pyramids. But we still had one final question. How did the Egyptians hoist these huge stones hundreds of feet into the air to create a pyramid taller than the Statue of Liberty? Well, cranes? They didn't need cranes. They had sleds, rollers, and even ramps. Just this month, the Egyptian government announced that the remains of what looks like a ramp has been found, and it's about the same age as the pyramids.
The Anglo-French team had been working in an ancient Egyptian quarry when they discovered a ramp with stairways.
A stone ramp with a series of post holes on both sides. So you'd push a stone up, wedge the poles in the holes, and then go to the next level.
That's amazing.
That is some early Egyptian scaffolding. Yeah.
So it looks like the Egyptians used ropes to pull and push the heavy stones up higher and higher along a ramp. And this was possible because they had thousands of people working on the pyramids for decades. And we have one last point to make. The ancient Egyptians didn't get this right on the first try. You can see the evolution of building and designing the pyramids over time. There are earlier first drafts, older, smaller, crappier pyramids that aren't as impressive as the Great Pyramid. They're still around. They just don't attract as much attention, probably because they're a bit ugly. So to Mark, there's just all this evidence, not only of how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids, but also how they lived, the layouts of their homes, their broken pottery, pieces of their clothes, and even their jewellery. And to him, this is proof enough that the ancient aliens' idea is bunk. There's just no way that another culture could come down, hang around for a while, give directions on how to build a cheeky pyramid, and then leave nothing behind.
Civilizations can't get lost. Civilizations are messy, garbage-producing networks of people, and they leave all kinds of crap.
Crap like diaries, canals, ramps, and everything that tells us the real story of how the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. And if you're still not convinced, well, all we can say is denial ain't just a river in Egypt. But really, what is going on here? Like, why do so many people seem to love this ancient alien story?
These claims of lost civilizations, of ancient aliens, of all kinds of mysterious things happening in the ancient world, they're powerful, they're seductive, they're interesting. And if they were true, they would be amazing.
That's David S. Anderson. He's an archaeologist at Radford University in Virginia. And he thinks a lot about why people hold on to alternative theories like ancient aliens. And for David, he says this isn't about dum-dums getting sucked into a hoax.
The reality is these kind of claims play not on stupidity, but they play on fascination and interest. They play on the notion that we want there to be more. And it's a little more depressing to think, well, actually, archaeology has good data on how the pyramids were built and where they were built and when people lived there. That's not as fun. That's not as interesting.
But as exciting as it is to think of aliens whispering in a pharaoh's ear, you need to build a ramp. David told us that these ideas are actually troubling. Not only do they fly in the face of hard evidence, like a fleet of wayward UFOs, but also you can trace this kind of thinking to the earliest days of European colonization. Centuries ago, colonizers were visiting places filled with people they thought were primitive, and yet they would see these huge, sophisticated structures. For them, it just didn't add up.
And so there was a strong tendency, and we see it repeated over and over again, for European colonizers to come up with stories about how these ruins must have been built by lost white civilizations. This happens in the United States. There are earthen mounds all over the eastern half of the United States that were built by Native Americans. And for centuries, Americans and American colonists would claim that those must have been built by some lost white tribe.
David talked about this with producer Rose Rimler, and he says now, instead of white tribes, it's aliens.
Either way, it's taking the achievements of one group of people away from them and handing it to somebody else.
Have you made that argument to an ancient alien believer?
I have. Typically, the response from the believers that I have engaged with is, no, this is just all about technology. And this is just, there's no way people could have built X building or raised X block. There's usually little interest in engaging with the data that shows, oh, you can build those buildings or you can raise those rocks.
David says that it's just really hard to convince people to follow the science and forget about their fun but flawed ideas. That was our experience with Eric, the grandfather of the ancient alien idea. We brought the evidence to him, but he just stuck to his guns. All the experts that we spoke to said we just don't need aliens to explain how we have the Great Pyramids. We have all the evidence in front of us. Why do you think differently?
No, they have not all the evidence. And all these scientists who say, we have the evidence, we do not need extraterrestrials. I'm sorry, they never understood the story of Eric von Däniken. They probably never read it. In the meantime, it's 41 books.
So when it comes to ancient aliens, does it stack up as well as the Great Pyramid does? No. Ancient Egyptians had the brains, the canals, the ramps, and the people power to get the job done. No aliens required. But try telling that to a believer, and unfortunately, you probably won't get very far. So it turns out that the biggest puzzle isn't how the pyramids were built, but how to change people's minds. The mystery of the mummy's tomb was inside us all along. That's Science versus Ancient Aliens. Hi, Rose Rimler.
Hi, Wendy.
Producer of Science versus Ancient Aliens.
My claim to fame.
How many citations in this week's episode?
There's over 90 in this week's episode.
Over 90?
Somehow we squeezed 90 citations out of this ridiculous topic.
Where can people find this?
They can find the link to the transcript in our show notes or in our newsletter, and that comes out every week. You can sign up for it by going to gimletmedia.com/newsletter.
Whoa!
Out of the studio!
And if you like this episode, there's another podcast that you might be interested in. It's called Stuff to Blow Your Mind. Stuff to Blow Your Mind is a science podcast that examines neurological quandaries, cosmic mysteries, evolutionary marvels, and more. It's hosted by Robert Lamb and Joe McCormick. In each episode, Robert and Joe try to make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Just listen to some of the topics they've covered. the evolution of the anus, the science of Tetris, and even dangerous foods like poisonous potatoes and hallucinogenic fish. Listen and subscribe to Stuff to Blow Your Mind on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode was produced by Rose Rimler with help from me, Wendy Zuckerman, along with Meryl Horn and Odelia Rubin. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sori. We're edited by Blythe Terrell. Fact-checking by Michelle Harris. Mix and sound design by Emma Munger. Music written by Emma Munger and Bobby Lord. A huge thanks to the team at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, as well as Professor Pierre Tallet, Roland Enmark, Jens Notrup, Professor Erin L. Thompson, and everyone else who spoke to us for this episode. Thank you so much for your help. An extra special thanks to Sarah Hendricks, Jake Finicum, Frank Lopez, Joseph Lavelle Wilson, and the Zuckerman family. I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the show that pits facts against floppy disks, against federal crimes, against computer fraud.
Stop.
What
these
about
are terrible.
files? Like computer files. What about
Science
the
versus
FBI?
files? Really? Please stop. Just stop now.
All right. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay. Hi, my name's Joel Werner, and I make a podcast called Sum of All Parts.
Joel is a science journalist from Australia. He's also a great friend of mine.
Aw.
And the reason that Joel is here today is because he's been working on this crazy story about the earliest days of hacking. And by the way, our story has a few naughty words.
This is a story that's sort of from the dark ages of the internet.
And the tale we're going to tell you is about an underground group of nerds who cobbled together their computers from like bits of gear they found in the trash. And yet, they became some of the most infamous hackers of their day, creating one of the world's first international hacking scandals. But our story, it starts with a different set of nerds. Nerds that had a ton of fancy, high-tech equipment, the best in the world. NASA.
To set it up a bit, this is October 1989, and NASA's getting ready to launch Galileo, which is the first spacecraft to ever orbit Jupiter.
We have a go for auto sequence start. Atlantis' 4 redundant computers have
It was this huge project, but it had also gotten to be really controversial.
Good afternoon. At Cape Canaveral, they are go for launch of the space shuttle Atlantis.
The launch of the Galileo space probe wasn't supposed to be controversial.
The shuttle and its 5 astronauts will deploy Galileo, an unmanned space vehicle that will fly to Jupiter.
But the controversy surrounding the launch was all because Galileo was a nuclear-powered spacecraft.
Wait a sec, so why was that controversial?
Well, people were worried that if the spacecraft exploded, then it would spew out radioactive fallout.
Really?
Yeah, you've got to remember that this is 1989, right? This is the last days of the Cold War, so people are freaking out about nuclear anything. And it's only a few years after the Challenger disaster, so NASA doesn't exactly have a perfect record here. In the lead up to launch, there were protesters camped outside the Kennedy Space Center. People started getting really fired up, but then something happened that made NASA really nervous.
The scientists would come in the morning and put down their cup of coffee and sit down and try and log in.
Dr. Soulette Dreyfus is a cybersecurity researcher at the University of Melbourne, and she sets the scene.
And they would find that instead of all their scientific data or their normal work, there was a screen that would appear that said, your system has been wanked.
What? Your system has been wanked?
Oh, I know. It's amazing, right? And so wank's an acronym. It's like worms against nuclear killers. Wank.
Worms against nuclear killers. That's the lamest acronym I've ever heard. They clearly just wanted to say the word wank.
But this is actually part of the Galileo protests, right? So you have the physical protesters outside the Kennedy Space Center, and inside, online in the NASA system, is this wank worm. And it kind of freaks NASA out for good reason, right? So the thing about computer worms is that they're kind of like computer viruses, except they spread on their own. So they have the potential to cause a lot of damage. Here's Soulette.
So this worm was, a self-propelling bit of software that would infect and hop from machine to machine, network to network, and would get out and basically spread by itself. So this was very alarming, and it started affecting first dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of machines.
And so the worm was spreading, wriggling beyond NASA. You see, the NASA network is connected to the US Department of Energy, CERN in Switzerland, and the Riken Accelerator Facility in Japan. The wankworm had gone international. And this worm wasn't just telling people that their computer had been wanked, it was telling them that their files were getting deleted. There's a doco about this called In the Realm of the Hackers, where they interview a NASA guy who was there at the time. And this is how he describes it.
What happened initially was that there were a lot of phone calls going back and forth and a lot of confusion. There were different things you would see depending on what the worm was trying to do to your machine. It would say, "Hi, I'm deleting all your files," and start listing your files and saying delete, 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 delete.
In the end, NASA realized that the wankworm wasn't actually deleting files. It was just telling people that it was. The Galileo launch went off without a hitch, but even so, this whole thing was hardly benign. The worm took weeks to get under control. It's estimated that it cost NASA $500,000 in wasted time and resources, and all for what seemed to be an anti-nuclear protest. But still, in a weird way, this was groundbreaking.
The NASA network was invaded by one of the first worms, computer worms in the world. And in fact, the first worm that had a political message.
Yeah, get that right. This is the world's first hack with a political message.
That is crazy. Like, when you think about people hacking for political purposes these days, it just feels like it's everywhere. I mean, these groups can get into basically anything they want.
They allegedly breached government websites, major financial services, entertainment conglomerates, and law enforcement networks.
People are saying Russian hackers influenced the US elections.
12 Russian intelligence agents hacked multiple Democratic Party targets in 2016.
The Russians hacked the computers of the Democratic Party organizations.
And yet, one of the earliest hacks like this, basically ground zero for hacktivism, was this dinky little wankworm?
Hey, every journey starts with a solid wankworm, right? But you got to remember, like, back in the 80s, computer worms were really new, so not that many people would have seen anything like this before. Now, once NASA figured out how to stop the worm wanking, so to speak, they wanted to know where the hell it had come from. The FBI is called in, and soon they find out that the worm first came from outside the US, from a foreign computer. Initially, computer logs pointed to France, and so the French took a closer look.
The French Secret Service had investigated where some of these connections were coming from, because I think they were worried that the American investigators were going to pin this on them because some of the connections had gone through France. But they were able to trace connections back to Australia.
Australia? But why would any Australian care what NASA was doing? But there was something else that tied this to Australia. Hidden in plain sight on that screen that said your system has been officially wanked was also a cheeky reference to something very Australian.
Also in the wankworm was a banner that had appeared in infected machines. And there was a quote at the bottom that said, "You talk of times of peace for all and then prepare for war." And no one knew where this was from. They thought, oh, it's some sanctimonious worm writer who's hacked this and sent it out there.
You talk of times of peace for all and then prepare for war? The FBI had no idea where this came from. But then a computer expert in Australia figured it out. In fact, it was Dr. Soulette Dreyfus flipping through her record collection who put 2 and 2 together.
So it was from a Midnight Oil song from a fairly obscure album called Species Deceases. But of course, that was the political message. And that is, in a sense, what made this worm so special and unique, was not just that it could jump from network to network. It was that it contained a message, an idea it was trying to spread.
Oh man, it's from a Midnight Oil song that is so Aussie.
Mate.
okay. So for the uninitiated, Midnight Oil is a huge Aussie band, particularly in the 1980s. Americans might know them for that song "Beds Are Burning." You know, do it with me, Joel. How do you sleep
How do
when
you sleep when the beds are burning?
But seriously, though, I can't believe this was hackers in Australia in 1989. I mean, did Australia even have the internet back then?
Like, just barely. Australia's internet was switched on 4 months before the NASA hack in June of 1989.
That's amazing. 4 months. We had the internet for 4 months and then hackers got into NASA. I mean, this really goes to show that we can't have nice things to play with.
Yeah, totally.
So that's all it took. 4 months of being connected to the internet, and Australian hackers were breaking into NASA. After the break, who did this? And will they get caught?
At that point, whoever was responsible had emerged in a kind of hazy silhouette from the forest, but not clear enough to make out who it was, and then they slipped back among the gum trees.
Welcome back. We just heard the story of how in the 1980s, hackers infected NASA with a worm that became known as the wank worm. An electronic trail of clues and a very cheeky Midnight Oil reference suggested Australians were behind it. And this was in the really early days of the Aussie internet. Reporter Joel Werner is telling us the story from here.
Right, so it turns out that it only took a few months for a bunch of newbie hackers to start causing some serious shit to go down. And if you're looking for hackers in Australia in 1989, Melbourne was a great place to start. The city was a bit of a tech hub, and alongside it, this fringy punk tech community was starting to take shape. This is Dr. Sulette Dreyfus again, and she wrote a book about these hackers.
This early underground scene was comprised of a real mix of people. At heart, there were people who were explorers on the frontier of technology, explorers on using computer networks to talk and communicate with people in other countries, to learn information. A lot of them turned to semi-legal activities of breaking into university systems, telecom systems, not so much because they were criminals, but because they couldn't otherwise get access to this incredible technology that they knew existed.
They'd do whatever they had to get their hands on the latest technology. There was a real sense of DIY in this scene.
So they would go dumpster diving on the weekend. They would go to both private companies and telecom, and they would go to the garbage dumps out the back, and they would open them up and crawl inside and trawl around in the trash in order to find the manuals or bits of hardware that might have been discarded. These were absolute treasures. They were like gold.
A vibrant tech counterculture was fast evolving online, and its members would interact via these primitive text-only chat rooms called BBSs, or bulletin board systems. Now, these BBSs became really important. It's where hackers would meet to talk strategy. For the hackers, this was their war room.
One of the key things here is that no one was using the real name. You know, people were using handles, and that was a relatively new thing. They would run this literally out of their bedrooms. Like at the end of their bed would be a table with this computer and a set of modems hooked up. And then you would basically log on to leave messages for people with similar interests. And that was extraordinary. People didn't have that before.
But like all cliques, these bulletin boards had fringes and they had an inner sanctum.
But then there were the back rooms, you know, the gambling rooms, the smoking rooms. And in these rooms, selected groups of people would trade in the currency of this new community, and that was information.
And at the back of the most exclusive rooms was a hacker collective known as The Realm.
The Realm traded information between the hackers who were in it, but the hackers who were in it also traded and shared information with overseas hackers.
Julian Assange is the most high-profile former member of The Realm, but at the time, its best and brightest were two teenage boys with the handles Phoenix and Electron.
So Phoenix is arrogant and clearly intelligent, but a braggart, pretty extroverted. He is very kind of cocky and sure, but also pushy in a way that advances their exploration.
Fucking bullshit.
Electron is very wry, quietly spoken, holds things close to his chest, but very technically adept, very willing to tap, tap, tap until you actually get through to the other side.
Already stars of the local hacking scene, Phoenix and Electron began
Just fucking
working
kill
around
me.
the clock,
Fuck it.
trading information and techniques with the elite hackers of Europe and the US.
There was definitely an attitude with the top hackers in other countries that the Australians were really serious players. If you said you were an Australian hacker, you got a bit of respect. And it was in part because of these guys.
Which takes us back
We have ignition and liftoff.
to NASA and the Galileo spacecraft.
The Galileo spacecraft bound for Jupiter.
So was it Phoenix and Electron who infected NASA with the wankworm?
Well, look, we know it was Australians who did it, and these two were amongst the sharpest hackers going around. In Sulet's book, which, by the way, she worked on with Julian Assange,
Oh,
and
wow.
they interviewed a bunch of the hackers from this time, including Phoenix and Electron. And in the book, she describes a scene where Electron's dancing around the dining room table chanting, "I got into NASA, I got into NASA."
Oh, man.
So, I know, right? It would seem to suggest maybe that he was behind it, but yeah, like no one was actually ever arrested or charged over the wankworm hack specifically.
Right, okay. But they are looking very, very suspicious.
Yeah, we don't know for sure it was them, although we can heavily suspect, right?
Right.
And from here, the plot thickens even more because Phoenix and Electron are about to really up their game. And that happens when they get their hands on Zardoz. So Zardoz was an online newsletter that described all kinds of cybersecurity vulnerabilities.
Zardoz was a kind of a holy grail for the hackers. Zardoz was where they would share security holes that they found for networks, for systems. And this gives you access not just to one system, but to all the systems running that technology. It is a master key. And it was actually, the name was taken from a science fiction cult film which had starred Sean Connery.
It is the only path and passage into the vortex.
With Zardoz, not only can you get into a network, you can essentially take control of the network.
That kind of power is immense and giddying. It was absolutely giddying to these, late teens, early 20s boys, often many of whom had never left Australia, had never owned a passport. To have that kind of access is incredible.
And, of course, being bored teenagers trapped in the suburbs, egging each other on, they start to use their newfound power. They go on a rampage, breaking into high-profile network after high-profile network and showing no sign of slowing down.
They've been penetrating systems at Los Alamos National Labs, Harvard University, Digital Equipment Corporation, Bell Systems, University of Texas. It's a long list of prestigious institutions. And they're not going for the small Fred's backyard pool digging service. They want to go for the big guys.
So now that they've got Zardoz and access to all the vulnerabilities, Phoenix and Electron start hacking into heaps of computers and really quickly, back to back, hack after hack. So much so that people assume there must have been another worm on the loose, automatically spreading from computer to computer. That's how the New York Times reported it in March 1990. Phoenix read their report and loved that his work was getting written up in the Times, but he was also kind of pissed that his hard work hacking into places was being attributed to some worm. And this This moment right now is the beginning of the end for Phoenix and Electron.
Phoenix calls up the reporter of the New York Times and brags to him about the fact that, no, it's not a worm breaking into these machines. It's actually people. It's not a rogue program. It's people.
John Markoff at the New York Times wrote an article based on his conversation with Phoenix, and it made the front page. And Phoenix was super excited by this.
Phoenix is at this stage saying to Electron, well, do you think we can make the cover of Time or Newsweek? And Electron's kind of head slapping, going, really? What is this guy on about? And so that's where, in a sense, it starts to go particularly pear-shaped, because Electron is horrified to know that Phoenix has done this. He's a low-key kind of a guy. He wants to stay a low-key kind of guy, and he wants to stay out of prison. So he actually packs up his modem at that stage and gives it to his father and says, hide the modem from me so I can't log on. He is successful in finding the modem. It takes him, I think, a couple of days. And there it goes, plugged back into the wall, and he's off and running again.
And while all this is happening, the police are also closing in. That front page article in the New York Times, well, that got the FBI's attention, and they started hassling the Australian Federal Police, or AFP, to do something about these hackers.
The FBI is calling the AFP and saying, do something about these noisy hackers. And that's when it all begins to become unraveled.
Initially, at least, it looked like the AFP would have no chance.
Why am I not doing any fucking damage here?
Computers. I mean,
they're so fucking dumb.
Typewriters in the late 80s. And there was also a bit of a cultural disdain for cybercrime from within the police force. One cop
fucking
at the time
full
said,
arguments.
funnily enough, that
Fucking
cybercrime
stupid.
was considered to be, and I quote, a bit of a wank.
It's funny.
This is supposed to be one of the top tier barber boots.
Both the AFP
fucking bullshit.
and the early hacker community were, in a sense, financially impoverished. They couldn't just go out and buy lots of equipment. They had to completely improvise. I know the AFP had to beg, borrow, and steal equipment from financial
Which fucking
institutions,
galaxy?
from other organizations. Could we borrow this? Can
Sure
we
as
have your
fuck
old
ain't
gear
this
that you're
one.
throwing out? I mean, they were all but dumpster diving themselves and pleading, can we just have that for a month so they could experiment with it?
When the AFP decided to get serious about cybersecurity, they had to rethink the whole way they gathered evidence. Basically, they had to link what was happening online with the real people that were doing it. And it was all so new that no one really knew how to do it.
So they actually developed this high-speed modem tapping capability, and it was one of the first in a criminal investigation.
Phoenix and Electron never saw it coming. In those final weeks, these hackers of their generation grossly underestimated just how close the police were getting.
The AFP had tracked down the Realm hackers, and they were watching and ready to pounce, and they needed to wait until they had gathered enough evidence and then get in and get them.
And get them, they did.
Electron, who's been hacking till late at night, and he gets up to go use the loo, have a wee in the wee hours of the morning, and the lights go out for reasons he couldn't figure out. And then all of a sudden, the police are bursting through his door or his window, coming into his room, you know, throwing him down on the floor. His father was, I think, completely surprised by the raid. I mean, he had some inkling that his son was up to a bit of mischief, but not the kind of mischief that would see a half a dozen police officers raining down on the house in the middle of the night. Not like that. And it's funny because, I mean, some of the hackers thought that they would be mentally prepared and used to joke that they would be mentally prepared for when the cops came. But I think none of them were.
On April 2nd, 1990, less than a year after Australia first connected to the internet, Phoenix and Electron were arrested. and they were charged with getting unauthorized access to computers in the US and Australia. In court, they both pleaded guilty, but kind of remarkably avoided jail time, getting several hundred hours of community service each. While Julian Assange graduated from the realm to create WikiLeaks and, come to dominate the international spotlight for better or for worse, Phoenix and Electron, they both retired from the world of hacking and they've effectively disappeared.
Really? No one knows where they are?
I mean, I tried to track them down reporting this story. I talked to a bunch of people who were around at the time, but it was really just a series of dead ends. I think all I could figure was that if people this skilled at computer science want to disappear, then they can kind of just disappear.
So then, what do you make of this whole story, of this endeavor? What's the Aesop moral to this fable?
Yeah, does it have to have one? I don't know. I understand that what they did and the way that they did it has, ramifications that are still reverberating around us now, 30 years later. But I also just think this is a story of a couple of bored teenagers in suburban Australia. I was that bored teenager, I grew up in the suburbs in the 80s. There was nothing much to do. So you just do stupid shit to keep yourself entertained. And my stupid shit was throwing rocks into windows in abandoned buildings, and their stupid shit was breaking into NASA,
Yeah, and now that the internet has evolved to be so much more than it was then, I mean, bored and smart kids can just break so many windows.
They can break Windows 95, Windows 98, Windows XP.
It's stressing me out. How can we dance when our earth is turning?
Oh,
how do we sleep while our beds are burning? Down, down, down. That's Science Versus. A version of this episode first played on Joel's podcast, Sum of All Parts, which is amazing, and you've got to subscribe, Sum of All Parts. It's a show produced out of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and a new season will be out early next year. My favourite episode, other than this one, is one called The Sound of Seizure. It's episode 7, so you've got to check it out, Sum of All Parts. Links will be in our show notes, along with a transcript of this episode, full of citations, of course. The original story was produced by Joel Werner. Science Versus is me, Wendy Zuckerman, Rose Rimler, Meryl Horn, and Odelia Rubin. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sori. We're edited by Blythe Terrell. Mix and sound design by Emma Munger. Music written by Emma Munger and Bobby Lord. Our fact checker is Michelle Harris. A huge thanks to Alex Goldman, Jason Scott, Chris Avron, Professor Graham Farr, Barbara Ainsworth, the Zuckerman family, and Joseph Lavelle Wilson. Next week, we're exploring transgender. Can science help us understand what makes us the gender that we are?
I'm not gonna be a mother. I'm gonna be a father. He was like, you know what? Okay, if you work hard, you can be anything you want to be.
I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next time. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. On today's show, being transgender. What makes us the gender that we are? And what should you do if your kid doesn't fit the mold?
Something that's been getting a lot of attention recently, the subject of being transgender.
Recently, transgender people have been in the spotlight a lot. There's all these trans characters on TV shows like Transparent and Orange is the New Black.
I'm finally who I'm supposed to be. Do you understand? I can't go back.
Caitlyn Jenner came out as trans just a few years ago to a flurry of publicity.
How do you feel?
Fabulous.
Meanwhile, more kids are exploring their gender and coming out as trans. One study found that the number of kids seeking medical care for gender issues quadrupled in the last few years. For some, this is an exciting time with more support of transgender folks. But others are nervous about what's going on. They're saying, wait a minute, what's happening here? Why does it seem like there are more trans people around all of a sudden? And could all this focus on trans folks be endangering kids?
We're doing barbaric things by cutting body parts off and then jamming kids with hormone therapy. We're ruining people's lives.
This all came to a head a few months ago when it was reported that the Trump administration is considering a new legal definition of gender for the federal government. It's one that basically says there's no such thing as being transgender, and the genitals you're born with pretty much define whether you're a man or a woman. So what's going on here? Who's got the evidence to back up their claims? To find out, we're going to dive into the following questions. 1. What makes us the gender that we are? 2. If a kid says they're transgender, what should you do? And 3. If you change your body with hormones and surgery, what are the risks? When it comes to gender, there are lots of opinions. But then, there's science. Actually, science has messed up its treatment of transgender people for decades. We'll talk about that too. Science Versus is coming up just after the break.
Quentin here runs a sustainable clothing brand.
Hi there.
He's excited that his shipping company FedEx has set a goal of having carbon-neutral operations by 2040.
Impressive.
When an influencer tweeted about his recycled bamboo t-shirts, Quentin unexpectedly became quite popular.
I'll take it.
He uses FedEx to reach new customers around the globe while making Earth a priority. FedEx, where now meets next.
Welcome back. Today we're talking about the science of being transgender. And we wanted to start with this question of what makes us the gender that we are. Like, why do I think I'm a woman? And to find out, we headed to Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan to meet Joshua Safer. He directs the Transgender Medicine Center.
Okay, fine.
This is an amazing array that you have on your desk.
A lot of stuff. Yeah, well, you know how organized people are with a big mess. Everything's exactly where it needs to be.
It's like a beautiful mind, what I'm looking at.
And right after I gave Josh a hard time for his clutter, he started schooling me because I thought that not that many people were transgender.
I mean, because it is rare.
It's not rare. No, that's false. We're talking about, by surveys, maybe 0.5% of the population. So that's 1 in 200 people. That's not rare.
It's estimated that more than 1 million Americans are trans, which means their gender identity, that is how they feel, doesn't match the genitals they were born with. Like maybe you identify as a woman, but you have a penis. And that idea can be a bit hard to wrap your head around because we often think about our genitals and our gender going hand in hand. You know, just like that expert on anatomy told us in the 90s.
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
Okay, so that's from Kindergarten Cop. It is essentially what Trump is saying too, though. So, is it science?
If you have a penis, are you a man?
So your genitals never defined your sex, and that narrow definition has not existed for decades. So even
for decades.
Correct. That's just so wrong.
And one of the reasons that Josh says it's so wrong is because there are people who are born without a clear penis or a vagina, and yet many say they either feel like boys or girls. That is, they have a sense of their own gender, even if what's between their legs isn't obviously a penis or a vagina. There's also people who are born with no genitalia at all. And these people, they identify as something. So from this, scientists know, and have known for a very long time, that feeling like a woman doesn't live in your vagina. It did get me thinking, though, could gender be about chromosomes? Like, if babies are born with an X and a Y, will they be males? And Josh says, not necessarily. We've got lots of evidence from other conditions where people have XY chromosomes, but they're women. Like, Josh told us about this one particular condition.
You will be born with a very visible and conventional looking vagina.
So even though these individuals are XY, do most of them identify as females?
Yeah, that's exactly the point. Almost all of them have female gender identity.
Now, most people who are trans don't have these conditions, but the fact that these conditions exist tells scientists that your sense of your own gender doesn't simply live in an X or Y chromosome, or even in your genitals. Which raises the obvious question of where does it live? And it turns out that trying to answer this question has led scientists down a path that caused big problems for transgender people for decades. And it all started with this idea that whether we feel like a boy or a girl or something in between was largely shaped by our environment. That is, that nurture was more important than nature.
We were certain that was, in quotes, a known thing for decades.
The reason that I think I'm a woman is because my parents raised me as a woman.
Yeah, exactly right.
And so if they had raised me as a man, as a boy, and started calling me Bobby, I would have been perfectly happy with that.
So yeah, exactly at that.
This idea started to take off in the 60s, and in the 80s, when Josh was in medical school, that's what he was taught. And for doctors like Josh, this wasn't just theoretical. They were acting on it. Josh remembers seeing baby boys whose penises hadn't formed properly, and more senior doctors would talk to the parents about what to do.
You would say your child is healthy, but we have this slight abnormality, but don't worry because we can fix it surgically.
The fix was simply turning a penis into a vagina. And afterwards, they'd tell the parents, don't worry, gender is all about how you raise your kid. And you have a girl now. Here's what you do.
Well, you want a very feminine name. You want to put them in dresses. You want to hand them a Barbie doll. You want to do whatever you can get away with.
And this was done?
This is standard operating procedure.
And Josh says that this standard operating procedure fed into the way that doctors treated trans people too. The fact that trans people were saying, I was raised as a man, but I feel like a woman. It just didn't make sense in a world where gender was basically shaped by your environment. And so, to the medical community, the only possible explanation for trans people saying this was that they were sick. Now, not all doctors thought this way, but enough did that in 1980, the DSM, the Psychiatrist's Bible, first started labeling trans people as having a mental disorder. In fact, they put it under the same heading as pedophilia and bestiality. And so, trans people would be sent to therapists to be cured. Producer Meryl Horn asked Josh about this.
And so what would happen when they went into that counseling? The goal of it was basically get yourself out of it.
Yeah, convince yourself that actually that's just not true what you think. And this is your body and this is what you are. And the fact that you think you are otherwise is wrong.
In some cases, trans people were forced into hospitals for months on end or subjected to electric shock therapy. And so the medical establishment went on like this for years. But things started to shift in the 1990s and into the 2000s. There was this burst of activism from the trans community.
They're not going to be fired for who and what they are, and they're not
and protests across the country where trans people were saying, I know who I am. I'm not crazy. Listen to me.
We're going to fight. We're going to fight to the end. Yeah! We're going to fight.
And then something happened that ripped the dogma to shreds. Reports started coming out about some of these kids who were given vaginas by their doctors. And it turned out the Barbie dolls weren't working. A bunch of these kids who were raised as girls were saying, I'm a boy. One mum who went through this with her little kid went on Oprah in 2000.
I had complete faith in the doctor. I believed it would be best. There were doubts along the way, but I couldn't afford to contemplate them because I couldn't afford to be wrong. I couldn't have faced the alternative.
That you'd made this horrible mistake.
Yes.
Just 4 years later, in 2004, her son killed himself. It was becoming clear that gender didn't just come from the environment. There was something inside these kids telling them the gender that they were. And for Josh, reading about these kids completely upended what he knew. And now he says,
we cannot change people's gender identity despite the most intense program for doing so, right? I mean, what is more intense than raising somebody? You know, it's like the Truman Show, right? We're raising somebody from infancy to believe something, having their parents part of the plan, and surgically altering their body for the plan, and still it fails. If that's not going to work, I don't think anything is going to work to change your gender identity. So I'm calling that a failure.
And where do you think, like, doctors at the time got that confidence to just say, wow, you know, if let's just make a vagina and make sure we call her Sally?
It felt logical. I can't claim that there was
felt.
Sorry. Yeah, the medical community has been wrong.
The medical community was wrong about those babies, and it was wrong about people who are transgender. In 2006, the full extent of how bad things were for trans people reached the scientific community. A large survey, the first of its kind, came out, and it showed that huge numbers of trans folks were attempting suicide.
It is horrible. I mean, it's terrible. You know, people suffer in massive ways when we make mistakes.
And that takes us to where we are now. Through this messed up history, we now know that there is something hardwired that helps us feel like a boy or a girl or somewhere else in the gender rainbow. So our next question is this: what is that thing? So why is it that I think I'm a woman?
The reason you think you're a woman is at least heavily because there is something in your brain that is programmed to tell you that you are a woman.
And what is that thing in my brain?
That we don't have worked out.
Scientists have looked in the brain, but so far they haven't found a particular thing that always shows up in, say, people who identify as women. As of now, it's looking like I know I'm a woman, partly because of this complicated dance between my hormones and my genes. And genes really seem like a big piece of this puzzle. In fact, one study published a few years ago looked at identical twins and found that when one twin was transgender, 40% of the time, the other twin was too. And in the land of genetics, that's a lot. There are even case reports of twins raised apart and then both coming out as trans. So even though we don't know exactly what makes up our gender, we know that sometimes what's under our skirts and how we feel about ourselves doesn't match up.
There is no question within those medical communities. Nobody raises their hand and says, oh, do we believe that transgender people are legit? That just isn't a thing anymore in a conventional medical community. So the idea that the out there in the lay world that people think that there are doctors debating, that's not true.
Still, though, it took a long time for science to work this out. The book that psychiatrists use to treat their patients, the DSM, it only stopped listing transgender as a mental disorder 5 years ago. The World Health Organization only made the switch this year. After the break, the newest controversy. If your child tells you they're in the wrong body, Mummy, I'm a boy, not a girl.
Kids who are saying things like, God made a mistake, or I want to cut off my penis.
What should you do? That's coming up after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about what makes us the gender that we are. And even though we don't know exactly what that thing is, it's clear that for some people, their gender identity doesn't match the body they were born with. Amongst most scientists, that is not controversial. What feels controversial now, though, is how you handle kids who say they're transgender. What do you do if your 2-year-old son says, "I'm not a boy, I'm a girl"? And this is what a lot of people have their knickers in a twist over, because some say that you need to trust your kid and do something about it, while others think, no. This is just a phase, and by indulging it, you'll ruin your kid's life.
They're going to make moves where the kid can't go back.
Can't go back.
It's
Their
like-
life is over. You literally turn their life down a dark path.
Children are having their normal psychological development interrupted. This is child abuse.
And at the heart of this debate is this one question. Can a child really know if they're transgender or not? Because if they can't, and a lot of these kids will just grow out of it, then it is kind of scary to think these kids might be put on life-changing drugs. So maybe our knickers should be in a twist. We talked this through with Laura Edwards-Leeper, a kids clinical psychologist and associate professor at Pacific University in Oregon. She was also one of the first clinicians in the US to treat transgender kids.
I was really, the only psychologist in the United States who was starting to do assessments for transgender adolescents who were seeking medical interventions. So that part was, pretty anxiety producing.
Laura has been working with trans kids for over a decade in her career. She reckons she's worked with about 500 of them. So we took this question to her about whether this really is just a phase for trans kids. Because there's a lot of numbers getting thrown around that make it sound like a lot of kids will just grow out of this.
80 to 95% of children would naturally grow out of it. 98% of the cases in boys.
As many as 95% will come to embrace their bodies and identify.
So we asked her, is it true? Do the majority of kids grow out of this?
Well, the research doesn't show that. I'd say that's incorrect.
Laura told us that some studies seem to show that lots of trans kids will change their mind. And here's what those studies are doing. They take a group of kids from a gender clinic and follow them. And they find that most of those kids aren't trans when they grow up. But Laura says we have to be careful with what this means, because a lot of these studies are just scooping up all the kids at the clinic, not just those who say they're trans. And kids can end up at gender clinics for all kinds of reasons.
They can be a boy and wear dresses and like sparkly things, and that doesn't mean that they're necessarily a girl.
Well, they've just worked out dresses are really fun and many men are missing out.
Exactly. So, I think what sometimes has happened in the earlier research is they've lumped all of these gender diverse kids into the same category.
Basically, Laura says that these studies are tracking all kinds of kids. Gay kids, tomboys, boys who like nail polish, and then saying, hey, most of them are not trans. True, but not particularly useful. Laura says you really need to zoom in on the kids who are having serious issues with their gender identity. And she's met a lot of kids like this.
Sometimes we have these little kids who are so, just disconnected from their body, and they just really feel so strongly that this is not the body I'm supposed to have.
Now, we couldn't find any studies that have tracked a lot of kids like this over time to figure out how many of them are trans when they grow up. And that means currently we do not know the percentage of these kids that will grow up to be transgender adults. With no good data, we asked Laura about her experience. In your practice, have you seen any kids that are super insistent and then do ultimately stick with the gender they were born with?
Yes.
Like they do switch ultimately?
I have. Yep, I have. Not many, not many of them. But if we're talking about the kids who are saying things like, God made a mistake, or Mommy, why did you make me this way? Or I want to cut off my penis.
Oh my God, and you hear kids saying that stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, those are the kids that tend to be more likely to continue.
But Laura says that this whole argument over exactly how many kids will change their mind is kind of missing the point. Because ultimately, no one can predict which way any kid will go. So you have to treat each little tacker as they come.
And so we can't know from one child to the next what their ultimate identity is going to be. So, you know, I really think that this debate, we kind of need to just, you know, put that to rest a little bit, because I don't think it's really helping the cause on either side. It's just confusing things.
But even if kids are just exploring their gender, parents are still wondering, can they do any damage if they help their kids transition? Because a lot of the talking heads on TV are yelling about giving kids hormones and yucky chemicals and surgery. So is any of that justified? Well, Laura says, calm down. No one should be putting young trans kids on hormones.
Never. I mean, I'm not even sure, honestly, where they're getting that information. I mean, it's just not true. I don't know of a single place in the entire world that would consider giving hormones to young children. I mean, that's crazy.
The first step for a kid, if they want to, is to let them wear whatever clothes fit their gender. Let them pick a name that feels right for them and use pronouns, he, she, they, whatever your kid wants. This is called socially transitioning. And Laura says it can be huge for a kid.
There's often a light switch that kind of changes everything and causes the child to just, you know, feel much better about themselves.
And everyone we spoke to told us that not letting your kid do this isn't a benign choice. Generally, trans kids have really high rates of depression and suicidal thoughts. Yet, studies focused on just socially transitioned kids find their mental health was almost as good as non-trans kids. Plus, wearing a dress or cutting your hair, it's not exactly medically risky. Okay, so this idea that young kids are being put on chemicals, it's bunk. In fact, the first time that a trans kid will be put on medication to help them transition will be when puberty kicks in and they're around 12 years old. And even now, they're not taking hormones. They're taking something called puberty blockers. These meds suppress a hormone that triggers puberty, and this gives the kid more time to sort through their gender identity before their body really starts to change. And now, this sounds pretty hectic to stop puberty in its tracks. But actually, Laura told me that this is tried and tested. These puberty blockers have been used for more than 30 years.
It's been used for years for kids with precocious puberty. So, you know, younger kids who start puberty at a young age, like 6 or 7 or whatever.
What a name, isn't it? Precocious.
Yeah.
Precocious puberty.
Yeah.
I mean, this is
So it's been used for a long time for that.
Precocious puberty? It sounds like the Hermione Granger of puberty. And because puberty blockers have been used since the 80s, we can see how the kids who used them turned out as adults. And, as best as science can tell, these kids are healthy when they grow up.
So it's really an incredibly safe intervention.
Is it reversible?
The blockers are extremely reversible. And as far as we know, you know, there are no negative side effects.
So far, so good. No life-changing decisions, no dangerous meds. The kid can get off the trans train anytime. But there is a time.
There's no way I'm getting to 150.
You have to make a life-changing decision.
No fucking way I'm going to be able to get to 150 in a week.
On hormones. It usually happens when they're around 16. And this is a big decision. It means you're effectively using hormones, estrogen or testosterone, to change your entire body and your brain. So what are the risks now? To walk us through it, we're talking to Colt Gaumeier. He's a clinical psychologist in Texas. And Colt remembers what it was like to be one of those insistent kids who knew who they were at a young age.
I actually have video at age 3, sitting on my mom's lap, and we were watching Alvin and the Chipmunks, and my dad was saying, oh, you're sitting on your mom's lap. You love Alvin and the Chipmunks. When you become a mother, maybe you're going to watch Alvin and the Chipmunks with your children. And I looked at him and I said, nope. I said, I'm not going to be a mother. He said, well, okay, you don't have to be a mother. I'm going to be a father. He was like, you know what? Okay, if you work hard, you can be anything you want to be.
Colt transitioned more than a decade ago, and now he helps others transition as well. And Colt told us that taking hormones can have dramatic effects all through your body. He says it's kind of like going through puberty again. Your skin, fat, muscles, voice, and even libido can change. Colt told us about what it's like taking testosterone.
So you get more of a gut, less hips, and then you'll also get increased muscle mass, and you'll find that when you work out, it actually has real quick impact that you can see, which a lot of my friends would just kind of give me the eye and be like, how come now you can exercise and get all of these effects from it? And I was like, testosterone. They're like, I want that. And I was like, do you want a beard? In a low voice. They're like, no.
Producer Odelia Rubin spoke to a bunch of people about their transition and what it was like taking hormones. And everyone's experience was a bit different.
Truly, there's all these weird puberty things.
Like what?
Hair in weird places, the ever enjoyable voice cracking.
I'm able to participate in No Shave November right now, so that says something.
Libido, that definitely goes through the roof when you first start hormones.
I grew boobs and was going downstairs and things were bouncing in different ways than I was used to. My experience of being sexual was yes, nope, that's not working. Yes, nope, that's not working. Yes, nope, yes, nope, finally.
Yeah, so taking a bunch of hormones can have a huge effect on how you feel, and it causes these major changes in your body. From the studies we have, though, the hormones actually seem pretty safe. They might increase your risk of cardiovascular disease like blood clots, but the big unknown here is actually how they affect your fertility. Here's Colt again.
And so historically, when folks started hormone therapy, and this was my experience as well, just 11 years ago, we were told that, there's not enough research and just pretty much assume that once you start hormone therapy that you're rendering yourself infertile. So just make sure that you want to do this. And that's pretty terrifying,
But now we're actually seeing that there are trans men who, despite taking a bunch of testosterone, have still gotten pregnant.
We're seeing a lot of live, healthy births. People seem to be really happy. I'm connected on Facebook to hundreds of parents who happen to be trans, who have so many cute kids.
So while we know that some trans men are getting knocked up, there is a big catch here. As far as we know, the only way a trans man can get pregnant is if he transitioned after his body went through puberty. For both trans women and trans men, they need to go through puberty to be fertile. So this means for those kids who are going on puberty blockers and then straight onto hormones, they may be infertile. With all these unknowns and a risk to your fertility, you've got to wonder, do people regret this? Colt asks his patients all the time.
And the most common answer is no. And the second most common answer is yes. I wish that I would have known about this and started this way earlier in my life.
Studies of adults who have transitioned using hormones and surgery find that the vast majority of people don't regret it. One of the largest studies of its kind, which surveyed thousands of transgender people, found that less than 1% regretted getting their testicles or ovaries removed. Less than 1%. So when it comes to being transgender, what do we know? 1. What makes us the gender that we are? While science doesn't know for sure, we do know that a lot of this is in our genes. And the best evidence we have tells us that this is not a choice. You are the gender you are, and sometimes it doesn't match your genitals. 2. If a kid says they're transgender, what should you do? Well, let your kid explore who they are. If they want, cut their hair or let it grow out, that's fine. And if they're about to hit puberty, talk to your doc about puberty blockers. And 3, if you decide to change your body with hormones and surgery, will you regret it? The best evidence we have says that very few people regret getting surgery or taking hormones. There is one big risk, though, and that's to your fertility, particularly for kids who go straight from puberty blockers to hormones. Still, though, while there might be some risks with changing your body with hormones or scalpels, something much scarier is looming over transgender folks, and that's suicide. A survey of more than 30,000 trans people found that 40% had attempted suicide in their lifetime. That's way higher than the general population. It's 9 times higher. Here's Colt Gaumaya.
The transgender population has the highest rate of suicide attempts of any demographic in the United States.
And what we're learning now is that being transgender in itself doesn't seem to be bad for your mental health. Turns out what is bad for your mental health is the way trans people are often treated. They get bullied, kicked out of their home, and attacked. And the science is telling us that it's this mistreatment that's the biggest problem for transgender people. It's not hormones or surgery. Not surprisingly, when people don't get treated like garbage, it makes a big difference.
And I think the best thing about transition was having my family and friends support me all the way through it, and having my priest from small town Texas write me a letter about how brave I was and say I was always welcome in church. Yes, hormones are important and awesome, but in terms of like why I'm doing so well and so happy is because of all the sources of support that I got.
That's Science Versus. And by the way, this is Wendy from the future here. We've updated some facts in this show. For more details about what we changed, please check our transcript. It's in the show notes. Okay, time for the citations. Hello, Adelia Rubin.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Meryl Horn.
Hello.
So how many citations in this week's episode?
It's over 130 citations.
Oh my God, 130. And Adelia, if people want to read more, where can they find these citations?
They can find them on our website, and they can find a full link to the script.
Yeah, and I really recommend if you do have any questions, you want to know more about any of the topics we've mentioned, go to this script, check out the citations. Thanks, guys. This episode was produced by Adelia Rubin and Meryl Horn, along with me, Wendy Zuckerman, and Rose Rimler. Our senior producer is Caitlin Sori. We're edited by Blythe Terrell. Editorial assistance by Rebecca Kling. And by the way, if you want to hear more about this topic, you've got to listen to Rebecca's podcast. It's called the Trans-Pacific Partnership Podcast. Trans-Pacific Partnership Podcast. It's great. We'll link to it in the show notes. You've really got to listen. Fact-checking is done by Michelle Harris, Meryl Horn, and Rose Rimler. Mix and sound design by Emma Munger. Music written by Emma Munger and Bobby Lord. Thanks to all of the researchers we got in touch with for this episode, including Dr. Jack Turbin, Professor Anne Fausto Sterling, Assistant Professor Samantha Busa, Associate Professor Susan Stryker, Dr. Katrina Karkazis, Professor Neil Epperson, Paula Nera, Professor Michelle Forcier, and Professor Joan Roughgarden. And thank you to all the trans folks who shared their stories with us. We really, really appreciate it. Plus, thanks to the Zuckerman family and Joseph LaBelle Wilson. Next week is the final episode of this season, and we're following a cold case. A man has been found dead with a stolen identity. The police don't know what to do. Can science save the day? I'm Wendy Zuckerman. Back to you next week. Hi, I'm Wendy Zuckerman, and you're listening to Science Versus from Gimlet Media. This is the show that pits facts against fugitives. Today on the show, the mysterious case of a dead man who lived under a stolen identity for decades, and the controversial science that cracked the case. And the reason we're telling you this story is because it's the perfect example of the unintended consequences of new science. In this case, it's It's those DNA tests. You know, the one waiting for you under the Christmas tree to tell you where your ancestors are from. Well, it turns out that there are so many people using those tests that it's created this huge DNA family tree, connecting people who want to be found and those who don't. And by the way, the story we're about to tell you does talk a little bit about suicide, so take care when you're listening. And there's resources and numbers to call in the show notes. Our story begins in the summer of 2002. A man has been found dead in a quiet, leafy suburb about half an hour outside of Cleveland, Ohio. It's right next to Lake Erie. It was July, and it was so hot that by the time they found his corpse, it wasn't pretty.
It took a week to find the body, so he was literally covered with maggots.
This is US Marshal Peter Elliott. He sounds like the kind of guy who is never really out of uniform. Can you describe yourself for us?
Yeah, probably not. But, yeah, I don't feel like doing that. But I'm 56 years old, and I've been in law enforcement for 35 years.
The man who had been found dead had killed himself in his bathroom. And from what police could tell, it seemed like he lived a pretty lonely life. He lived in this tiny, bare-bones apartment, didn't have much. And from the look of the scene, here's how the cops thought it went down.
He counted down the days on the calendar. He locked all the doors in his apartment, went into that bathroom and put the gun underneath the roof of his mouth and shot himself.
The man's name was Joseph Newton Chandler III. The cops searched through his finances and found a bank account with more than $80,000 in it. The cops looked for relatives to call, and Joseph had listed a sister on his rental agreement. She lived in Columbus, Ohio, he said.
So, and I believe it was 1823 Center Street.
Remember this address. It's important. 1823 Center Street. The thing is, though, when the police went there was no sister. Pete told us that the place didn't exist. And that was kind of weird. But then something happens that takes this case from kind of weird to incredibly suspicious. Because the dead man was known as Joseph Newton Chandler III. But when the cops looked into him, they found out that Joseph Newton Chandler III had already been dead for more than 50 years. Joseph had died in a car crash as a young boy. What goes through the mind of a cop when that happens?
We go after fugitives every single day. So usually when people have totally fictitious identities, they do that for a reason. You just don't assume the identity, in my opinion, and through my 35 years of law enforcement, if you don't have a really good reason.
Pete could smell a rat, and now he needed to know two things. One, who was this mystery dead guy? And two, why did he live under a stolen identity for more than 20 years? Police didn't have a lot to go on. By the time they figured out how fishy this scene was, the body had already been cremated. So that meant the police had no DNA and no fingerprints. And then things got stranger. The cops worked out that this guy had lived a really weird life. He paid for everything in cash, didn't have credit cards, and when they went looking for friends to talk to, they couldn't really find anyone. The only people who seemed to know him were his workmates. He worked as an engineer. But what they had to say to the police made everything seem more suspicious.
He had a suitcase packed and ready to go at all times. He used to tell his bosses and people he's working with that they're getting close and didn't say who they were, and then he'd disappear for periods of time. They just thought he was basically a little crazy. They'd laugh about it.
The evidence soon dried up. The case hit a dead end and went cold. No one could figure out who this paranoid guy really was and why he stole someone's identity. But then, a couple of years ago, Pete Elliott created a cold case unit, and his team took another look at it. And they found something in his medical records that made them wonder even more. What is this guy about? Science Versus producer Rose Rimler and I talked to Pete about it.
Wasn't there something about him going to the hospital with cuts on his penis?
Yeah, that is correct. And I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't want to, but and is there any way I could put you on hold for 1 second? Sorry about that. We got a double homicide suspect that I got my guys on right now, so.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, we will get you off this phone in just a second.
That's all right. I got my guy. I had to call him real quick. They're on it right now, so I've got time.
Okay, sure. Can you tell us about the weird penis stuff?
Oh, yes. So 19, not a lot of medical records, but what we did find out from the medical records was this. In 1989, he went into the hospital and he had a lacerated penis. And he told the doctor that he had that from masturbating with a vacuum cleaner.
With a vacuum cleaner?
With a vacuum cleaner.
And do you believe that? Or could it have been something else?
Are you going to make that up? I don't know. I have no idea on that one. I mean, if you're going to come up with a story, are you going to come up with, hey, I was masturbating with a vacuum cleaner? But that gives you a little bit about his mindset.
Pete says it's hard to know what to make of this. But it was in the medical records that Pete and his team finally caught a break that didn't suck. They found this guy's DNA. Pete's team discovered that this man had been treated for cancer in hospital a couple of years before he died, and the hospital still had a tissue sample. Bingo. DNA. Pete's team rushed it through the National Database for Known Criminals. And it came up with nothing. No matches. So what do you do then in that situation? I mean, have you run out of options?
You pray a lot. That's what you do. So that's the best thing you can do.
Just a few years ago, this probably would have been the end. If your DNA didn't match anything in the police database, it was basically useless. But recently, things have changed. There's a new way of using this kind of evidence. It's possible to take DNA and use it to find a huge network of people who are related. And that might just eventually lead you to your mystery guy. To get this done, though, Pete would need a new breed of gumshoes. A bunch of real hard-asses.
I'm 71 years old. I've got short gray hair. I look like a grandmother.
This grandmotherly type is Margaret Press. She's an armchair sleuth who also writes mystery novels. She's basically a real-life Angela Lansbury from Murder, She Wrote.
I loved that program.
In a former life, Margaret worked in software development, but she always had an interest in genealogy. And then in retirement, she got really good at it. So good that after a while, she wanted a new challenge.
Finding yet another great-great-grandfather in Norway was interesting, but it wasn't solving a huge mystery.
And so, in her hunt for a huge mystery, Margaret became part of a growing network of amateur genealogists who have just started working with police to help them solve the unsolvable. They're volunteers and are literally doing this because they just love solving puzzles. I told you, basically Jessica Fletcher. And when Pete Elliott heard all about this, he reached out to someone in that network who soon teamed up with Margaret. So, could this gang find out who the mystery guy was? Now, Margaret had actually already been thinking about how to solve cases like this. It came to her when she was reading a mystery novel about an unidentified body.
I was sitting in a broken-down Sears Roebuck recliner in the living room. I can picture the moment because I turned the page finishing this book and put the book down and said, I can think of no way why this wouldn't work.
And here's where all those DNA tests come in. You know, the one under your Christmas tree? These days, So many people have gotten their DNA tested from sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com that it has created this massive web where you can find long-lost relatives.
So this holiday season, it's Ancestry DNA per tutti!
In fact, so many people have their DNA info online that even if you personally haven't gotten tested, there's a good chance that your distant cousin did, which means whatever DNA you share with your cousin is going to be out there. Now, for some, this is all a very creepy invasion of privacy. But for genealogists like Margaret, this is a potential gold mine. Now, she can't just log on to Ancestry and look you up. They have rules. There is a place for hardcore genealogists, though, where the rules are a little bit different. It's called GEDmatch. GEDmatch is different from the others because you don't send them your spit for analysis. Rather, you upload the DNA results that you got from a site like Ancestry. And nerds like this place because it lets you do a bunch of stuff that sites like Ancestry won't.
And I think it's amazing. Having that kind of knowledge is so important and so exciting.
For Margaret, one of the big things she could do on GEDmatch was use a dead man's DNA to find out who he was related to. And that was critical to solving the mystery of Joseph Newton Chandler.
Enough people had uploaded to GEDmatch so that statistically you could do searches there and find biological cousins or parents or second cousins, third cousins, etc. So that the pieces were starting to come together. There was a perfect storm.
Still, though, when Margaret and the team dove into this Joseph Newton Chandler case, this was pretty much uncharted waters. So Margaret was nervous. And using this technique to find out who this mysterious dead guy was really high stakes because of the DNA situation.
He had such a tiny amount of DNA left, and we used it all. And that was a heavy responsibility for us to know that we were the last chance of Joseph Newton Chandler ever getting solved based on his DNA.
The team had to get the DNA reanalyzed because they needed to find any possible relative to this dead guy. And that meant using a database that would search through thousands and thousands of bits of DNA, looking for similarities. So, after they rejigged the teeny bit of DNA they had, they crossed their fingers, uploaded their data to GEDmatch, and they got some useful hints. A few distant cousins of this mystery guy.
In this case, we were able to locate, maybe a fourth cousin, and that's how we started to create the network.
To build that network, Margaret has to take those few cousins to map out a family tree that eventually leads to the dead guy. And one of the first steps is to search for the first common relative connecting the fake Joseph to this distant cousin, someone like a great-great-grandparent. And after that, the team fills out the branches with more and more relatives, using literally anything they can get their hands on. They search online for obituaries, census records, newspaper articles, working their way down the tree to find someone who's the right age to be the mystery guy. And as you can imagine, things get really tricky really quickly.
I think of it, I guess, as when you get a very complicated